My name is Sabrina. I am 32 years old, and tonight I sat across from my adoptive parents at a luxury Chicago steakhouse as they slid a stack of legal papers across the table to officially disown me. My mother smiled over her expensive wine and said they only kept me around to collect trust fund benefits, and now that I was no longer useful, I was cut out of their lives forever. They expected me to break down and beg. Instead, I calmly signed the documents, looked them dead in the eye, and told them that the billionaire birth family I had secretly found 6 months ago was sitting exactly 3 tables behind them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing toxic people get exactly what they deserve. The evening began in the private VIP room of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. It was the kind of place with dark mahogany paneled walls, dim amber lighting, and waiters who moved silently to refill water glasses. I had arrived early wearing a simple but sharp-tailored suit. As a forensic auditor, my entire life revolved around precision. I paid attention to the tiny details that other people missed and uncovered the hidden truths buried beneath the surface of financial ledgers. My adoptive family, however, had always treated my profession like a tedious joke. To them, I was just a boring number cruncher who lacked the flashy glamour they so desperately craved. When my adoptive parents, Linda and Thomas, finally walked into the private room, they were flanked by my younger adoptive sister Ashley and her smug fiancé Bradley. Ashley was the undeniable golden child of the household. She was 30 years old, dripping in designer labels that our parents had gladly paid for, and she carried herself with a heavy aura of entitlement that filled the entire room. They did not even bother to wish me a happy birthday when they sat down. Thomas immediately flagged down a waiter to order a $300 bottle of Cabernet, making a deliberate point to ask the waiter to only bring 4 wine glasses. I was left with my glass of ice water. For the first 30 minutes, I sat in silence while they talked completely over me. Ashley bragged incessantly about the massive commercial real estate deal Bradley was allegedly closing the very next morning. Linda fawned over Ashley's massive diamond engagement ring, completely ignoring the fact that it was supposed to be my birthday dinner. I watched them perform their usual charade of the perfect affluent family. I knew this dynamic well. Growing up, I was always the quiet outcast in their sprawling suburban home. I was the child expected to stay out of the way, to be endlessly grateful for the basic roof over my head, and to never ask for the kind of warm affection they showered constantly on Ashley. But tonight felt different. There was a nervous, almost giddy energy radiating from Thomas. He kept checking his watch, a heavy gold timepiece that he constantly adjusted on his wrist. Just as the waiter cleared our appetizer plates, the atmosphere in the room shifted aggressively. Thomas reached into his tailored leather briefcase resting on the floor beside him. He pulled out a thick manila folder. Without a single word of warning, Thomas slid the heavy folder across the crisp white linen tablecloth. He shoved it so hard and so carelessly that the edge of the folder slammed directly into my crystal water goblet. The heavy glass tipped over, shattering the quiet ambiance of the room. Freezing cold ice water cascaded directly into my lap, soaking the fabric of my trousers and dripping onto the floor. Thomas did not apologize. He did not hand me a napkin. He simply tapped the top of the wet folder with his index finger. "Since you just turned 32 at midnight," Thomas said, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth, "the final mandatory payout from your late grandfather's trust fund has officially cleared today. The stipulations have been completely met. You have aged out of the dependency clause." I sat perfectly still, letting the freezing water drip onto the expensive carpet. My adoptive grandfather, Thomas's father, was the only person in this family who had ever shown me an ounce of genuine kindness. He had been a sharp, perceptive man who saw right through Linda and Thomas's superficial greed. Before he passed away, he tried to ensure I would not be thrown out on the street. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair and crossed his arms. "Inside that folder are the legal documents officially severing our ties. We are cutting you out of the will, Sabrina. You are no longer part of this family." We have no further legal or financial obligations to you. Linda took a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine. She set the glass down and smiled maliciously, her eyes sparkling with a cruelty she no longer felt the need to hide. Let us be totally honest with each other, Sabrina. We only kept you around for the benefits. Thomas's father refused to release the family trust to us unless we maintained a legal house dependent. You were a requirement for the payouts. Now that you are 32, the final check has cleared. You are not useful to us anymore. The words hung in the air, heavy and venomous. They expected me to crumble. They expected the abandoned, grateful orphan they had manipulated for decades to finally break down, to beg for their love, to ask what I had done wrong to deserve this. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me shatter in this beautiful, expensive room. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. My career as a forensic auditor had trained me to detach human emotion from raw facts. And the facts presented in front of me were simple. They were showing their true colors entirely unprompted and handing me the exact exit strategy I needed. Ashley let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the tension. She reached into her quilted designer handbag and pulled out her wallet. With an exaggerated sigh, she slid a crisp $100 bill out and tossed it carelessly across the table. It landed right in the puddle of spilled water, the paper instantly soaking through and sticking to the wood. "Take it," Ashley sneered, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Consider it a parting gift. You are just a glorified calculator, Sabrina. You have no connections, no charm, and no real future. Enjoy living in whatever cheap, cramped studio apartment you can afford now that the family charity has officially run out." Bradley chuckled beside her, shaking his head as if I were a pathetic beggar off the street. I looked at the wet $100 bill sticking to the mahogany table. Then I looked at Linda's smug smile, Thomas's cold glare, and Ashley's arrogant smirk. Slowly, I reached for a thick cloth napkin and casually dabbed the spilled water off my suit. My heart was not racing. My hands were perfectly steady. I opened the manila folder. Inside were the formal disinheritance documents drafted by Thomas's high-priced lawyers, severing my status as an heir and removing me from their estate planning. They had clearly been preparing this for months, counting down the days until my birthday, so they could finally cut the cord. I picked up the heavy metal pen resting next to the folder. I did not read the dense legal jargon. I did not need to. I flipped directly to the last page, pressed the pen to the paper, and signed my name with a smooth, decisive stroke. I signed the second copy, then the third. The room was dead silent. The triumphant gleam in Linda's eyes began to flicker into something resembling confusion. Thomas uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. They were unnerved by my complete silence. They had wanted a reaction, a dramatic scene to justify their cruelty, to prove to themselves that I was the unstable burden they always claimed I was. I closed the folder and slid it back across the damp tablecloth until it rested right in front of Thomas. "Funny you mentioned charity," I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady in the quiet VIP room. Ashley rolled her eyes. "Are you going to give us a speech now? Because Bradley and I have reservations at a club downtown, and we really want to get moving." I ignored her, keeping my eyes locked on Linda and Thomas. As a forensic auditor, my job is to follow the paper trail. I look at ledgers, tax returns, and corporate filings to find out where the money is really going. 6 months ago, I started looking into my own paper trail. I wanted to know about my adoption. I wanted to know the absolute truth. Thomas frowned, his fingers twitching on the table. "You were a closed adoption. The state records are permanently sealed." "Nothing is perfectly sealed if you know where to look," I replied, a small, knowing smile finally touching my lips. I traced the state subsidies, the original hospital records, and a very specific wire transfer that did not match the profile of a standard state adoption. I found out exactly where I came from. Linda scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, please. You probably tracked down some deadbeat parents who did not want you either. Spare us the sob story. We have given you everything." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, entirely unbothered by the spilled water. "I did not track down deadbeats, Linda. I tracked down the people who had been relentlessly searching for their missing daughter for over 3 decades. I found my birth family 6 months ago." Thomas let out a short, dismissive breath. Good for you. Go bother them for a handout then. I shook my head slowly, letting the silence stretch for just a second to build the anticipation in the room. I do not need to go bother them for a handout, and I definitely do not need your wet $100 bill, Ashley. I pointed to the frosted glass partitions that separated our private dining area from the rest of the exclusive restaurant, because my birth family did not want to miss my 32nd birthday. In fact, they are sitting exactly 3 tables behind you. The silence in the private dining room became absolute. Linda froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips, the dark red liquid swaying slightly. Thomas slowly turned his head, his thick neck stiffening as he traced the line of my gaze toward the dimly lit corner booth. Ashley let out a harsh nasal breath of annoyance, clearly thinking I was bluffing to save face. She twisted around in her chair to look her diamond earrings catching the light. Sitting in the curved leather booth were 3 people who commanded the space without saying a single word. Maxwell and Beatrice Kensington, the billionaire founders of Kensington Holdings, sat alongside their son Wyatt. In the Chicago commercial real estate sector, the Kensington name was royalty. They owned half the skyline. More importantly for the people sitting at my table, Kensington Holdings was the primary anchor client for Thomas's accounting firm. His entire standard of living, the imported suits, the luxury cars, the country club memberships he flaunted, was built exclusively on the billing hours his firm charged to their corporate accounts. Losing the Kensingtons would mean instant financial ruin. The color instantly drained from Thomas's face. His artificial tan seemed to vanish, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack. The arrogance that had radiated from him just seconds ago evaporated completely. He stumbled as he pushed his chair back. The heavy oak chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, and his linen napkin fell unheeded into the puddle of ice water. Thomas immediately shifted from the cruel, dismissive father who had just happily disowned me into a desperate, fawning businessman. He buttoned his suit jacket with shaking hands, wiped his palms on his trousers, and plastered a frantic, ingratiating smile on his face. Mr. Kensington. Thomas practically tripped over his own feet as he rushed toward their booth, extending his right hand. What an absolute and unexpected surprise to see you here tonight. I had no idea you frequented this establishment. If I had known, I would have sent a bottle of your favorite champagne to your table immediately. Please allow me to introduce my family. We are just over here celebrating a small milestone. Maxwell Kensington stood up. He was a tall, imposing man with thick silver hair and piercing dark eyes that mirrored my own. He completely ignored Thomas's outstretched hand. He did not even look down at it. Instead, Maxwell stepped right past Thomas as if he were nothing more than a piece of insignificant furniture blocking the walkway. Thomas dropped his hand, his desperate smile faltering into a look of sheer panic as he turned to watch Maxwell walk directly toward our table. Beatrice and Wyatt followed close behind, their expressions carved from stone. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with a suffocating, terrifying tension. Ashley shrunk back in her seat, her usual loud bravado disappearing in the presence of actual, undeniable power. Bradley sat rigidly, his eyes darting frantically between Wyatt and Thomas, clearly sensing the catastrophic shift in the room's dynamic. Maxwell stopped right behind my chair. He placed his large, warm hands on the back of my seat, standing over me like an impenetrable shield. It was the first time in 32 years that a father figure had ever stood behind me for protection, instead of standing in front of me to block my path. The physical weight of his presence behind me was overwhelming. Beatrice Kensington stepped up beside him. She was a vision of fierce, quiet elegance. There was no flashy jewelry, no desperate need for attention like Linda constantly displayed at every social event. Beatrice carried the kind of grace that came from genuine confidence and deep sorrow. She looked down at me, and I saw a lifetime of unshed tears shining in her dark eyes. But when she turned her gaze to Linda, those tears instantly hardened into glacial ice. Linda gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone-white against the wood. Linda stammered, trying to match her level of composure, but failing miserably. I am not sure what sort of game Sabrina is playing here, but you really should not let her bother you with her nonsense. She has always been prone to making up these wild dramatic stories for attention. We were just finalizing some necessary legal paperwork for her transition to full independence. Beatrice stepped forward, closing the distance until she was standing directly over Linda. She placed one hand gently, almost reverently, on my shoulder. The warmth of her touch sent a shockwave through my chest. "You have spent 32 years treating my daughter like a bank account," Beatrice said, her voice terrifyingly calm but echoing with raw, unfiltered fury. "Your lease on her life expired at midnight." Linda gasped, her mouth falling open in shock. She looked from Beatrice to me and then back to Beatrice. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently. "That is impossible. You are insane. Sabrina is a ward of the state. She came from nothing. We took her in when no one else wanted her. We saved her." Thomas rushed back to the table, looking frantic and breathless. "Mrs. Kensington, please. There is a massive misunderstanding here. I swear to you, Sabrina was a closed adoption. We went through the proper state channels and family courts. We have the sealed documents to prove it. She is trying to manipulate you to get back at us for cutting her off financially." I finally stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my suit jacket, ignoring the damp spot on my trousers, and looked Thomas directly in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "As I told you earlier, Thomas, I am a forensic auditor," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional and devoid of the tears they so desperately wanted to see. 4 months ago, my firm was contracted to audit a complex corporate merger involving a private childcare logistics agency. It was supposed to be a routine financial review to ensure compliance before the acquisition. But when you spend your entire life looking for missing numbers, you get very good at finding hidden patterns. I found a series of irregular, unrecorded cash transfers routed through a shell corporation dating back over 3 decades. I followed that paper trail. Ashley crossed her arms, trying to regain her footing and act tough. "So, what, you found some shady accounting at some random agency? What does that have to do with these billionaires claiming you are their kid? You are delusional." I turned my gaze to Ashley, letting a cold, victorious smile form on my lips. "The paper trail led directly to my own falsified adoption records, Ashley. I found the original hospital logs hidden in a digital archive. I found the altered birth certificate. I found the specific offshore accounts used to facilitate a closed adoption that never should have legally happened. My birth was not a secret, and I was not an abandoned ward of the state. I was taken, and you two were paid handsomely to look the other way and hide me in plain sight." Thomas grasped the back of his chair, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. "You have no proof of that. You cannot just throw around wild accusations of human trafficking and corporate fraud. I am a licensed CPA in this state. My reputation is impeccable." "Your reputation is a meticulously crafted lie," I fired back, stepping away from the table to stand firmly beside my biological mother. "And your accounting is incredibly sloppy when you think no one is watching." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I held it up high so the ambient light of the crystal chandelier caught the metal. I kept my eyes locked on Linda, watching the last bit of color completely drain from her face. "Remember when I was 10 years old, Linda?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, precise whisper. "Remember when I begged you for piano lessons and you told me I wasn't elegant enough to learn music? You told me it would be an absolute waste of money because I lacked the natural grace required for the fine arts. The very next day, you bought Ashley a custom beaded pageant dress for $3,000. You sat in the living room and told me it was bought with your hard-earned savings." Linda swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the restaurant doors, as if calculating an escape route. "I do not remember every trivial childhood argument, Sabrina. We provided for both of you to the best of our abilities." I tossed the flash drive onto the table. It landed with a sharp clack right next to the signed disinheritance papers and the wet $100 bill. "It was not a trivial argument, and it was not your savings," I said, "because I tracked the wire transfers from that exact month. You are using my state adoption subsidies, the money designated specifically for my housing, education, and welfare, to fund Ashley's beauty pageant dresses. Every single time you told me we could not afford basic school supplies for me, you were illegally routing my state funds directly into Ashley's personal expense accounts. I have the entire 32-year ledger on that drive, Linda. Every stolen dollar, every fraudulent transfer, every dime you drained from my existence to build your golden child's perfect life. The flash drive sat on the table like a live grenade. Thomas stared at it, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Linda looked physically ill. But Ashley, the golden child who had never been told no a single day in her life, could not handle the sudden shift in gravity. She could not stand that the attention was no longer entirely focused on her and her massive diamond ring. Ashley pushed her chair back so violently it nearly tipped over. She slammed her hands down on the table, leaning forward with her face twisted into an ugly, furious snarl. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are lying!" Ashley shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany walls. "You are a jealous, pathetic liar. I do not care who these people are or how much money they have. You are still just Sabrina. You are the loser who sat in the corner of our house reading boring textbooks while I actually made something of my life. You are trying to ruin my night because you know you will never ever be as successful as me." She grabbed Bradley by the arm, yanking him upward so he was forced to stand next to her. Bradley stumbled, his smug smile entirely gone, replaced by a look of profound discomfort. Ashley clung to his bicep like a life preserver. "My fiancé is a partner at an elite commercial lending firm," Ashley bragged, her chest heaving as she practically spat the words at me. "Bradley is closing a $50 million waterfront development deal tomorrow morning. We are going to make millions in commission on a single signature. We are going to be richer than you could ever dream of. You can bring all the fake flash drives you want, Sabrina. You are just a bitter, lonely accountant, and I am about to be the wife of a real estate mogul. So take your little fabricated sob story and get out of our sight." I did not even have to respond. The retaliation came from the man standing to my left. Wyatt Kensington stepped forward. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who held the keys to the city. He did not raise his voice. He did not look angry. He looked entirely bored, which made his presence infinitely more terrifying. Wyatt casually slid a sleek smartphone out of his tailored suit pocket. He tapped the screen once to wake it up, his dark eyes locking onto Bradley. Bradley instantly shrank back, trying to subtly pull his arm out of Ashley's iron grip. As a commercial lender in Chicago, Bradley knew exactly who Wyatt Kensington was. Everyone in the financial district did. Wyatt was the ruthless operating officer of Kensington Holdings, a man who could bankrupt a mid-sized corporation before his morning coffee. "You are Bradley Vance, correct?" Wyatt asked. His voice was smooth and conversational, yet it carried the sharp edge of a guillotine. "You are the junior partner handling the Riverside Marina acquisition." Bradley swallowed so hard his Adam's apple bobbed visibly. "Yes, sir." Bradley choked out, his voice dropping an octave in sheer terror. "It is an honor to meet you, Mr. Kensington. I have closely followed your work on the downtown revitalization project." Wyatt did not smile. He simply stared at Bradley as if he were observing a bug on the pavement. "Your firm relies on an equity backing model for Tier 1 acquisitions." Wyatt said, his fingers flying across the screen of his phone as he spoke. "You act as the face of the deal, but you require a primary institutional investor to front the initial capital. You secured a $30 million bridge loan to cover the gap for tomorrow's closing. Is that accurate?" Bradley was sweating now. Tiny beads of moisture dotted his forehead. He nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. We secured the backing through Apex Capital. We signed the final papers at 9 tomorrow morning. It is a completely solid deal." Wyatt stopped typing. He looked up from his phone and met Bradley's terrified gaze. "Kensington Holdings acquired a controlling majority stake in Apex Capital 3 days ago," Wyatt stated calmly. "It was a quiet acquisition, so I am not surprised a junior partner like you missed the memo. But as the new majority shareholder, I have absolute discretionary power over all active bridge loans." Wyatt tapped his screen one final time and slid the phone back into his pocket. "That commercial deal you are closing tomorrow," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a freezing register. "I just pulled our funding. You are over-leveraged and bankrupt as of 60 seconds ago." The air in the room vanished. Bradley's face went from pale to a sickening shade of gray. His eyes widened in absolute horror as the reality of Wyatt's words crushed the breath out of his lungs. Without that bridge loan, Bradley's firm was on the hook for millions of dollars they did not actually have. The deal was dead. His career was instantly catastrophically over. Almost on cue, Bradley's smartphone began to buzz violently in his jacket pocket. It buzzed once, then twice, then a continuous frantic vibration that sounded like a swarm of angry bees. Bradley yanked the phone out with shaking hands. The screen illuminated the dim room. It was flooded with high-priority emergency alerts from his senior partners. Bradley let out a strangled, animalistic sound of pure panic. He stared at his phone, his chest heaving, his entire future disintegrating right in front of his eyes. Then he snapped. He whipped his head around and glared at Ashley. The loving, adoring gaze he usually reserved for his golden fiancée twisted into absolute unhinged fury. "What is wrong with you?" Bradley screamed at the top of his lungs, completely abandoning the quiet decorum of the luxury steakhouse. He ripped his arm away from her so violently that Ashley stumbled backward. "You dragged me into this mess. You told me we were just coming here to sign some standard trust documents. You did not tell me you were bringing me into a war with the Kensingtons." Ashley stared at him, her jaw dropping in shock. "Bradley, baby, stop. They are bluffing. They cannot just do that. You are going to be a millionaire tomorrow. Tell them you are going to sue them." "Are you out of your mind?" Bradley roared, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "They own the bank, Ashley. They own my firm. I am ruined. I am completely ruined, and it is all because of your insane, toxic family. You could not just sit here and be quiet. You had to open your mouth and provoke them. You dragged me down with you." The perfect, affluent family dynamic shattered into a million jagged pieces right there in the restaurant. Ashley, humiliated and completely unable to process rejection, began to scream back. She stomped her expensive heel into the hardwood floor, her face twisting into a spoiled, ugly tantrum. She threw her silk napkin directly at Bradley's chest. "Do not you dare talk to me like that!" Ashley shrieked, her voice cracking. "You are supposed to be on my side. I am the victim here. She is the one ruining my life. Mom, tell him to stop screaming at me. Dad, do something. Call your lawyers. Fix this right now." Thomas jumped up from his chair, holding his hands out in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Bradley, please let us calm down. We can figure this out. I have connections. I can make some calls. We can find new funding by the morning. Just step back and lower your voice. Do not touch me." Bradley shoved Thomas's hands away with aggressive force. "I am done with all of you. You are a bunch of frauds. You used me for my status, and now I am bankrupt because of your psychotic daughter. The engagement is over, Ashley. Keep the ring. You are going to need it to pay your legal fees." Bradley grabbed his coat off the back of his chair, gave Wyatt one last terrified, apologetic look, and bolted out of the private room. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind him, leaving Ashley standing completely alone. Ashley let out a piercing wail of absolute devastation. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her perfect, wealthy future evaporated into thin air. She sank into her chair, no longer the arrogant golden child, but a miserable, broken mess. Linda could not handle the loss of control. Her husband's career was on the verge of destruction. Her favorite daughter's engagement had just exploded in spectacular fashion, and the quiet, obedient victim she had planned to discard was standing tall, surrounded by a family of billionaires. Linda's mind snapped. The carefully maintained facade of the elegant suburban mother completely fell away, revealing the desperate, vicious woman underneath. Linda slammed both of her fists onto the wet tablecloth. She leaned forward, her eyes wild and manic as she glared at me. "You ungrateful little monster!" Linda screamed, her voice hoarse and ragged. "How dare you do this to us? We gave you everything. We saved your life. You stand there acting like some superior genius with your little flash drives and your audits, but you owe us your very existence." Beatrice Kensington took a threatening step forward, her eyes flashing with maternal fury, but I gently held up my hand to stop her. This was my fight to finish. "You owe us." Linda continued to shriek, spittle flying from her lips. "You think you are so smart because you tracked some adoption money. What about the rest of it? What about the last 10 years? Thomas's father's trust fund ran dry when you turned 22. The money completely stopped. But we did not throw you out. We used our own hard-earned money to keep you fed. We used our own savings to pay for your cheap college tuition. We sacrificed our own comfort to keep a roof over your head when we legally owed you absolutely nothing. You should be down on your knees thanking us for keeping you alive when the family trust went bankrupt. I stood perfectly still. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her finish her frantic, desperate lie. I let the silence stretch across the room until the only sound was Ashley's pathetic sobbing and Thomas's ragged breathing. I looked down at the signed disinheritance documents. Then I looked up and met Linda's wild, furious eyes. I smiled. It was a cold, surgical smile that promised absolute devastation. The trust didn't run dry, Linda. I said, my voice echoing with quiet, undeniable certainty. I audited that too. I reached down to the floor and picked up my own sleek, structured leather briefcase. For years, Linda and Ashley had mocked this bag, calling it a tragic masculine accessory that proved I had absolutely no sense of style. They had no idea that for the past several weeks, this exact briefcase had been carrying the weapon of their total destruction. I popped the brass clasps, reached inside, and pulled out a massive, heavy, black-bound audit ledger. I raised the ledger high and slammed it down onto the center of the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the private dining room like a gunshot, making Linda jump in her seat and causing Ashley to flinch violently, her sobs cutting off into a sharp hiccup. I rested my hands flat on top of the black cover, my posture perfectly rigid, my voice dropping into the cold clinical register I used when testifying in corporate fraud depositions. "You really thought Grandfather Arthur was a fool," I said, staring directly into Thomas's wide, panicking eyes. "You thought he was just a sentimental old man who threw a dependency clause into his trust fund because he wanted to force a happy family dynamic. But Arthur was the sharpest man I ever met. He saw right through your artificial charm, Thomas. He knew exactly how greedy you were, and he saw exactly how Linda treated me behind closed doors. He knew that the second he died, you would throw me out onto the street and keep his money for yourselves." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively, but he could not find his voice to interrupt me. "Arthur structured that multi-million-dollar trust as an ironclad trap." I continued tapping the thick ledger. The stipulations were extremely specific. The trust only paid out to your accounting firm if I remained a recognized, legally housed dependent under your roof until the exact moment I turned 32. Do you know why he picked 32? Because he did the math. He calculated that by my 32nd birthday, I would be entirely finished with my education, fully established in a high-level career, and completely capable of defending myself against you. He forced you to shelter me, to feed me, and to tolerate me because if you kicked me out even one day early, the entire trust would immediately dissolve and transfer to a wildlife charity. Linda crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face pale, but her expression still stubbornly defiant. "We know how the trust works, Sabrina. We lived with it. We housed you. We fulfilled the terms of the agreement. The money is legally ours now. You are just bitter that the free ride is over." I opened the heavy black cover of the ledger and flipped halfway through the thick stack of meticulously tabbed pages. I spun the massive binder around so it faced Thomas directly. "You did not fulfill the terms, Thomas," I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You violated them on a federal level." Thomas looked down at the open pages. I watched his eyes track over the highlighted columns, the printed bank statements, and the red ink circling specific transaction dates. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His mouth fell open, and a faint, trembling wheeze escaped his lungs. The trust was designed to hold the principal amount in a protected escrow account. I explained to the room, though I kept my eyes locked on Thomas to watch him break. It generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in dividends every year. You were legally permitted to draw a modest fixed monthly stipend for my room and board. The rest of those massive dividends were legally required to sit untouched, accumulating interest until today. But your accounting firm has been quietly failing for a decade, has it not? You were losing clients to modernized firms. You were bleeding cash trying to maintain Linda's ridiculous country club memberships, leasing luxury cars you could not afford, and financing Ashley's designer lifestyle. You were desperate for liquid capital. Thomas began to shake. His hands trembled so violently against the edge of the table that his silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. I traced my index finger down a long column of printed wire transfers. You needed the trust money early. But the bank required my legal adult signature on a release authorization form every single quarter to unlock the excess dividends, so you forged it. Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Ashley stared at her father in stunned silence, the reality of the word forgery slowly penetrating her self-absorbed bubble. You have been forging my signature for the last 10 years, Thomas. I stated, my voice echoing like a judge reading a final sentence. You falsified legal documents to siphon over $4 million out of my protected escrow account and funneled it directly through a labyrinth of dummy corporate accounts straight into your failing firm. You did not keep me around all these years for the legal benefits. You kept me because if I ever walked away, if I ever declared myself independent and legally severed our ties, the trust administrators would have triggered an automatic mandatory financial review. I leaned closer, ensuring he heard every single syllable of his doom. You kept me here because you were terrified. You knew that if I left, you would be instantly exposed for federal embezzlement. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The air in the private dining room felt incredibly thin. Thomas was a certified public accountant. His entire professional existence, his licenses, his reputation, and his freedom relied entirely on strict financial compliance. Embezzlement was not just a mistake, it was the total catastrophic end of his life. Suddenly, the sheer terror in Thomas's eyes morphed into a wild, cornered rage. The polished, arrogant patriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, trapped animal fighting for survival. "You lying witch!" Thomas roared, his voice cracking with panic. He slammed his fist down on the table, causing the crystal glasses to clatter wildly. "You fabricated this. You printed out a bunch of fake spreadsheets to blackmail us. This is criminal defamation. I will sue you for every penny you ever earn. I will drag you through the courts until you are destitute. I will personally call the state board and have your auditing license permanently revoked. You will never work in the financial sector again." He was shouting so loudly that the veins in his neck bulged against his collar. But beneath the screaming, I could see the frantic calculation in his eyes. He realized that the heavy black ledger sitting right in front of him was the physical proof that could send him to a federal penitentiary. In a blind, unthinking panic, Thomas lunged forward. He threw his entire body weight across the wide table, knocking over his expensive glass of Cabernet. The dark red wine spilled across the white linen tablecloth like fresh blood, but Thomas did not care. He stretched his arms out as far as he could, his fingers clawing desperately toward the open ledger, intent on ripping the pages out and destroying the evidence right there in the restaurant. He never even touched the paper. Before Thomas's fingers could graze the heavy black cover, a massive hand clamped down around his wrist. Maxwell Kensington moved with a terrifying explosive speed that defied his age. He stepped smoothly from behind my chair, his large hand locking around Thomas's forearm like a mechanical steel vise. The sheer physical power of the billionaire halted Thomas's desperate lunge completely dead in its tracks. Thomas gasped in pain, his eyes wide with shock as he hung suspended over the table, entirely immobilized by Maxwell's grip. Maxwell did not look angry. He looked completely and utterly unbothered, gazing down at Thomas with the casual detachment of a man examining a stain on his shoe. Without uttering a single word of effort, Maxwell slowly and effortlessly pushed Thomas's arm backward, forcing the frantic accountant to sink back down into his chair in absolute defeat. Maxwell kept his left hand firmly planted on the table, shielding the ledger. With his right hand, he casually pulled back the crisp cuff of his immaculate suit jacket. He tilted his wrist, calmly checking the face of his luxury Patek Philippe watch. He studied the time for a brief, agonizing moment while Thomas sat paralyzed, breathing in shallow, terrified gasps. Maxwell lowered his wrist and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. He delivered his final sentence with a chilling, effortless calmness that froze the blood in Thomas's veins. "I wouldn't touch that. Maxwell stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble that resonated through the floorboards. My legal team submitted these exact documents to the FBI and the IRS 3 hours ago. The words hung in the suffocating air of the VIP room, an absolute death sentence delivered with the casual indifference of a man confirming the weather. Thomas did not fight back. The fight drained out of him instantly, leaving only a hollow, trembling shell. The sheer gravity of the acronyms, the FBI and the IRS, hit him like a physical blow to the chest. As a certified public accountant, Thomas knew exactly what federal involvement meant. It meant asset freezes. It meant dawn raids. It meant federal prison. Maxwell released his grip, and Thomas slumped backward into his chair, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blankly at the red wine dripping off the edge of the table onto his imported leather shoes. Linda, however, possessed a different kind of survival instinct. While Thomas was a creature of financial ledgers, Linda was a creature of social manipulation. She saw her husband collapse. She saw the ironclad proof sitting on the table. She recognized instantly that they could not win on the facts. The law and the math had cornered them completely, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She pivoted to pure, unadulterated emotional warfare. Linda knew the frosted glass partitions separating our private dining area from the main restaurant were not soundproof. She knew that the dining room was packed with the exact kind of people she spent her entire life trying to impress: wealthy socialites, corporate partners, and country club elites. If she was going down, she was going to drag me down with her by twisting the narrative so violently that no one would know what to believe. Linda threw her head back and let out a piercing, theatrical wail. It was a loud, ragged sob designed to cut through the ambient noise of the entire restaurant. She knocked her chair backward, dropping to her knees beside the table, burying her face in her hands. "Somebody call the police!" Linda screamed, her voice echoing into the main dining room. She lifted her head, her face a mask of manufactured terror and heartbreak, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "She is insane. My daughter has completely lost her mind." The chatter in the main dining room instantly died. I could see the silhouettes of patrons turning in their seats, pressing close to the frosted glass to witness the spectacle. Linda stood up, leaning heavily against the table, sobbing loudly for her audience. "We gave you everything, Sabrina. We took you in when you were nothing. We loved you like our own flesh and blood, and this is how you repay us, by fabricating these vile, disgusting lies." She turned her tear-streaked face toward Maxwell and Beatrice Kensington, clasping her hands together in a posture of desperate pleading. "Mr. and Mrs. Kensington, please, you must listen to me. You have to get away from her. She is a dangerous, pathological liar. She has spent months stalking your family, obsessing over your wealth. She is a sociopathic grifter trying to seduce her way into your good graces to steal your money. She is trying to destroy a loving family because we finally refused to fund her unstable lifestyle." Ashley, catching on to her mother's desperate strategy, immediately joined the performance. She covered her mouth, letting out loud, gasping sobs, nodding vigorously. "She threatened us," Ashley cried out, looking toward the glass partitions. "She said she would ruin our lives if we didn't give her my father's business. She is a monster." Linda wept louder, wiping at her eyes, expertly playing the role of the devastated, generous matriarch, betrayed by a wicked, ungrateful child. I watched her perform. I watched the fake tears roll down her perfectly powdered cheeks. I watched her weaponize the very concept of motherhood to try and execute me in the court of public opinion. I did not interrupt her. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I had anticipated this exact manipulation from the moment I planned this dinner. You cannot outscream a narcissist playing the victim. You simply have to let them dig their own grave, and then you hand them the headstone. While Linda continued her hysterical weeping monologue about my supposed mental instability and her endless maternal sacrifices, I calmly reached into my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. Earlier in the evening, before they arrived, I had noticed the digital interface panel mounted on the wall of the VIP room. High-end steakhouses often equipped their private dining areas with corporate presentation technology. I had quietly paired my phone to the room's Bluetooth surround sound system. I unlocked my screen. I opened my audio files. I tapped the file labeled Living Room Thursday. I maxed out the volume and pressed play. A sharp electronic click hissed through the overhead speakers, followed by the crisp, undeniable sound of a match striking and ice clinking against crystal glasses. The audio quality was flawless. Then Thomas's voice filled the room. It was not the panicked, trembling voice of the man currently sitting at the table, but the relaxed, arrogant, cruel voice he used when he thought no one was listening. Just 3 more days until the final check clears, and we can finally take out the trash. Thomas's recorded voice echoed clearly through the restaurant. I have the disinheritance papers drafted. The second the clock strikes midnight on her birthday, our legal obligation is void. Linda's recorded voice answered him, followed by a harsh, genuine laugh that completely shattered the weeping, victimized facade she was currently putting on. God, 32 years of pretending to care about that boring little calculator. Linda's voice sneered through the speakers. She is such a pathetic drain on my energy. I cannot wait to see the look on her stupid face when we hand her the papers and tell her she is completely alone. Make sure you freeze her secondary accounts before the dinner, Thomas. I want her walking out of that restaurant with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. Already done. Thomas's recorded voice chuckled. The escrow funds are fully transferred. We bled that trust dry right under her nose. She is so stupid she never even noticed. Good. Linda's recorded voice sighed with deep satisfaction. I already picked out the new Porsche I am buying with her final payout. She was nothing but a cash cow anyway. Let her go rot in the streets where she belongs. I tapped the screen and stopped the audio. The silence that slammed down over the restaurant was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating, total silence. Linda's fake tears instantly stopped falling. Her mouth hung open, her lips trembling soundlessly. Her performance had collided with undeniable reality, and she was left standing there exposed, stripped naked of her lies in front of the most powerful people in the city. I had placed a small voice-activated recorder under the sofa in their living room the weekend before, knowing they would not be able to resist gloating over their brilliant plan to destroy me. I looked at Linda, who was now clutching her chest, her eyes wide with sheer terror as she realized the entire restaurant had heard every single word. You should really be more careful about what you say in your own home, Linda. I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence like a scalpel. You never know when the boring little calculator is auditing your conversations. The social ruin was instantaneous and absolute. Beyond the frosted glass, the elite patrons of the restaurant were reacting. There were no shouts, no dramatic gasp, just the cold, brutal sound of social excommunication. At a large round table directly outside the VIP room sat Richard Sterling and Arthur Vance, the managing partners of the city's largest corporate law firm. They were Thomas's primary sponsors at the Oakbrook Country Club and his most critical networking allies. Thomas had spent 5 years kissing their shoes to gain access to their elite social circle. Through the glass, I watched Richard Sterling lock eyes with Thomas. Sterling's face was twisted in pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not say a word. He simply reached into his wallet, threw a stack of $100 bills onto his half-eaten steak, and stood up. Arthur Vance did the same. Without a single backward glance, the two men turned and walked out of the restaurant. Other tables immediately followed suit. The whispering began a toxic, fast-spreading contagion of judgment and revulsion. People were signaling their waiters packing up their coats and leaving. They were not just leaving the restaurant, they were walking out of Thomas and Linda's lives forever. In the span of 60 seconds, their carefully curated social standing, their country club memberships, their dinner party invitations, and their entire reputation evaporated into dust. They were officially pariahs. Thomas sat in his chair, his chest heaving as he watched his biggest business partners walk out the door. He watched his social empire crumble to the floor. He looked at the heavy black audit ledger that was about to send him to federal prison. He looked at his weeping, ruined wife and his sobbing, abandoned golden child. His entire existence had been dismantled surgically and perfectly in under 30 minutes. The realization that his life was completely over snapped the final thread of his sanity. The polished, cowardly accountant vanished. His eyes rolled back, flashing with pure homicidal rage. He let out a guttural, roaring scream that tore from the bottom of his throat. He kicked his chair back so violently it shattered against the wall. Before anyone could blink, Thomas lost his temper completely and lunged across the wide table directly at me, his hands outstretched like claws aiming straight for my throat in a blind, murderous rage. Thomas's hands clawed the air mere inches from my face, his fingers hooked into rigid, desperate talons as he vaulted across the ruined table. He was entirely consumed by a blind, irrational rage driven by the sudden, terrifying realization that his entire empire of lies had just been incinerated. But before his hands could even graze the fabric of my suit jacket, a blur of dark, impeccably tailored fabric intercepted his violent path. Wyatt Kensington moved with a lethal, calculated speed that was breathtaking to witness. He bypassed his father entirely, his large, powerful hands clamping down onto Thomas's shoulders like a pair of industrial steel vices. With a single brutal thrust of his arms, Wyatt stopped Thomas's momentum dead in its tracks and shoved the disgraced accountant backward. The sheer force of the push lifted Thomas entirely off his feet for a split second before slamming him violently down into his heavy oak dining chair. The thick wood groaned loudly in protest under the sudden impact, and the chair skidded backward, scraping a harsh screeching note across the polished hardwood floor. Wyatt did not step back to give the man room to breathe. Instead, he stepped directly into Thomas's personal space, planting his hands firmly on the armrests of the chair, caging the sweating, panicking man completely. Wyatt leaned down until his face was mere inches from Thomas's flushed, blotchy forehead. "If you ever attempt to raise a hand to my sister again," Wyatt said, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying glacial fury, "you will quickly discover that federal prison is the absolute least of your problems. Do you understand me? Bankruptcy will feel like a luxury vacation compared to what I will personally do to you." Thomas shrank back against the leather upholstery, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. He nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Before Thomas could even attempt to formulate a pathetic apology, the heavy frosted glass doors of the private dining room swung open with an undeniable synchronized authority. The subtle, panicked murmurs of the stunned restaurant patrons outside were instantly silenced. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed against the hardwood, cutting through the thick, tense air of the room like a heavy blade. 2 men and 1 woman strode purposefully into the space. They were not restaurant management trying to quell a disturbance, and they certainly were not part of the country club crowd Thomas spent his life trying to impress. They wore immaculate, nondescript dark suits that screamed government issue. Their expressions were carved from solid granite, completely devoid of any emotion, sympathy, or hesitation. Gold badges glinted prominently beneath their open suit jackets, catching the warm, ambient light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp gray eyes and a military haircut, stepped squarely to the head of the table. He did not look at Linda's tear-streaked face, nor did he spare a single glance for Ashley's trembling, ringless hands. His gaze locked entirely onto the sweating, broken man sitting trapped in his chair. "Thomas Vance." The agent stated, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute compliance from every single person in the room. "I am Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. This is Special Agent Davis with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Unit." Thomas let out a high, thin wheeze. The remaining blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He looked frantically from the stoic federal agents to the heavy black audit ledger sitting on the table, the irrefutable physical manifestation of his guilt. Agent Miller reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and produced a thick, folded stack of legal documents. He flicked his wrist, snapping the crisp papers open, and held them out for Thomas to see. "We are executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. You are being taken into federal custody immediately on multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, tax evasion, and interstate embezzlement." Linda let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying to her throat as if she were suffering a sudden heart attack. She stumbled backward, bumping hard against the mahogany wall paneling. her eyes darting frantically around the room as the absolute crushing reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. Her husband was not just losing a client, he was losing his freedom. Thomas tried to stand, but his knees instantly buckled beneath him. "There is a massive mistake," Thomas stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed off the walls. "You cannot do this here. Not in front of everyone. I am a respected member of this community. I am a licensed, certified public accountant. You have been given the wrong information by a bitter, disgruntled dependent. This is a private family dinner. You have no jurisdiction to interrupt a private gathering. Agent Davis." The woman from the IRS stepped forward. Her expression was completely merciless, projecting the quiet confidence of an auditor who already held all the winning cards. "There is no mistake, Mr. Vance," Agent Davis said, her voice clipping through the tense air with surgical precision. "You utilized interstate banking networks to funnel misappropriated trust dividends through a complex web of shell corporations registered in Nevada and Delaware. That completely elevates your petty embezzlement scheme from a state issue to a federal level. We have been actively monitoring your accounts and server traffic for the past 3 hours." She gestured toward the black ledger sitting on the table. "When the Kensington legal team submitted the forensic audit compiled by Sabrina, the evidence of your financial crimes was so overwhelming, so meticulously documented, and so utterly airtight that a federal judge fast-tracked this warrant in record time. You left a digital paper trail a mile wide, Thomas. Your corporate arrogance made you incredibly sloppy. You really should not have tried to hide millions of dollars in stolen trust money in dummy accounts registered to your own residential address. It makes the asset seizure process far too easy for us." Thomas shook his head wildly, a line of saliva forming at the corner of his mouth as his breathing grew ragged. He looked at Maxwell and Beatrice Kensington, who stood silently flanking me. They were watching the total destruction of their enemy with cold, regal satisfaction, acting as an impenetrable wall of billionaire protection. Then Thomas looked at me. His eyes were wide, begging, pleading for a shred of mercy from the woman he had spent over 3 decades treating like disposable garbage. I met his gaze without a single ounce of pity. I simply stared back, completely unfazed, watching the fraudulent empire of lies he built collapse into dust. Agent Miller stepped firmly around the table, closing the distance. He grabbed Thomas by the bicep and hauled him roughly to his feet. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Miller ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. Thomas tried to resist, his shoulders twitching as a final pathetic display of defiance, but Miller expertly twisted his arm, forcing him to comply instantly. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly shut around Thomas's wrists, echoed loudly through the dining room. It was the unmistakable sound of finality. The sound of a man losing everything he had ever valued. Thomas let out a pathetic, broken sob as his arms were secured behind his back. The absolute humiliation of being handcuffed in the middle of an elite 5-star steakhouse, surrounded by the wealthy peers he had spent his entire life trying to impress, finally broke his spirit completely. He hung his head, his chin resting on his chest, openly weeping as the agents prepared to march him out the front doors. Linda could not process the sight of her husband, her primary provider, and her shield of social respectability being treated like a common criminal. The facade of the elegant, untouchable suburban socialite completely disintegrated. She dropped all pretense of dignity and threw herself toward Ashley, grasping wildly at her daughter's custom silk dress. "Ashley!" Linda shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical, ear-piercing pitch that caused the federal agents to wince. "Ashley, do something. Call Richard Sterling. Call the law firm right now. Tell them they have to get down here immediately. They cannot arrest your father. We need an emergency injunction. Get your phone out right now and call the lawyers. We need to stop this." But Ashley was not listening to her mother's frantic screaming. Ashley was already holding her smartphone. Her hands were shaking so violently that the expensive diamond-encrusted device nearly slipped from her fingers. She was not dialing a high-powered attorney. She was staring down at her glowing screen, her eyes wide, her pupils dilated in absolute, unadulterated horror. She was staring at her luxury boutique's primary business banking application. The screen was flashing bright red, displaying a series of urgent, catastrophic error codes. Ashley's breathing turned into shallow, hyperventilating gasps. Her face, usually bronzed and perfectly contoured, went bone white. All the blood rushed from her head, leaving her looking physically ill as her brain struggled to comprehend the numbers on the screen. Agent Davis turned her sharp, calculating gaze toward the panicking bride-to-be. "Yes, Miss Vance," the IRS agent stated, her voice laced with cold professional satisfaction. "You will find that your business accounts are currently inaccessible. As part of this federal operation, we have initiated a blanket freeze on all assets connected to the fraudulent shell corporations managed by your father. That includes the initial seed money, the operating capital, and the payroll accounts for your luxury boutique." Ashley let out a tiny, whimpering gasp, shaking her head in denial. "Every single dollar you used to fund your business," Agent Davis continued mercilessly, "was traced directly back to the stolen trust dividends. You were operating a business funded entirely by embezzled money. Therefore, your inventory, your storefront lease, your commercial accounts, and your personal checking accounts have all been seized by the federal government pending a full criminal investigation. You currently have exactly $0 to your name." Ashley dropped her phone. The device hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, the screen splintering into a spiderweb of broken glass, but she did not even blink. The devastating reality of the situation slammed into her all at once. Bradley was gone. Her multi-million-dollar engagement was dead. Her father was going to federal prison. Her luxury business was seized by the government. Her bank accounts were frozen. She was entirely, irreversibly ruined, stripped of her golden child status in a matter of minutes. Ashley slowly raised her head and looked directly at her weeping mother. The golden child's face twisted into an expression of pure, venomous hatred. She balled her manicured hands into tight fists, her body trembling with a rage that eclipsed everything else in the room. "You ruined my life!" Ashley screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice tearing through the restaurant as she lunged toward her own mother. "You ruined everything!" Ashley's piercing scream echoed through the tense, suffocating silence of the private dining room. She stared at Linda with pure, unadulterated hatred, but the moment she realized her mother was completely powerless to stop the federal agents, Ashley's survival instinct violently shifted gears. She spun around to face me. The venom and arrogance instantly vanished from her features, replaced by large, shimmering tears that rolled perfectly down her contoured cheeks. Ashley stumbled forward, pushing past the frozen waiters and the shattered remains of Thomas's dining chair. She dropped heavily to her knees right beside me, clutching the hem of my suit jacket with trembling hands. "Sabrina, please." Ashley choked out her voice, a breathless, pathetic whisper designed to elicit maximum sympathy. "You have to tell them to stop. You have to tell these agents that I had absolutely nothing to do with this." She looked up at me, her mascara running, playing the innocent, sheltered victim to absolute perfection. "I did not know, Sabrina. I swear to you on my life I had no idea where the money was coming from. Mom and Dad manipulated me. They lied to me for years. They told me the boutique funding was an early inheritance. They told me the luxury cars and the designer clothes were gifts for being a good daughter." Ashley reached up, trying desperately to grab my hands, but I remained perfectly still. "You know how they are. You know how controlling Dad is with money. I was just a pawn in their sick, twisted game. Please, you are my sister. We grew up together in the same house. You cannot let them take my business. You cannot let them take everything I have worked so hard to build." I looked down at Ashley's perfectly manicured hands clawing at my jacket. I did not pull away. I did not blink. I simply stared at the golden child, who had spent 32 years treating my very existence as a punchline. "We are not sisters, Ashley," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion, echoing with the cold precision of a judge. "And you have never worked a single honest day in your miserable life." I calmly reached down into my leather briefcase and pulled out a second, slimmer manila folder. I tapped the bottom edge of the folder against the mahogany table, the sharp, rigid sound cutting right through Ashley's manufactured sobs. "I am an auditor," I reminded her, looking down into her wide, panicked eyes. "I do not deal in feelings, and I do not deal in fake family loyalty. I deal in paper, and paper does not lie." I opened the folder and extracted a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photocopies. I let them drop one by one onto the table directly in front of Ashley's face. If you were truly a helpless victim of Thomas's manipulation, you would have been completely shielded from the financial logistics. I explained, my tone sharp and clinical. You would have simply received a blank check. But you were not shielded, Ashley. You were an active, knowing, and willing participant in a massive federal crime. I pointed to the first document on the stack. This is the commercial lease agreement for your luxury boutique in the Gold Coast district, I stated. It is signed by you. But the financial guarantor listed on the application is not Thomas Vance. The guarantor is me. You used my name, my social security number, and my fabricated trust assets to secure a commercial property that you could never afford on your own. Ashley let out a sharp, ragged gasp, her hands flying away from my jacket as if the fabric had burned her. I dropped the next document onto the pile. This is the title, the registration, and the financing agreement for the custom Mercedes SUV you drove to this restaurant tonight. Again, the physical signature belongs to you, Ashley, but the primary leaseholder is listed under my identity. You financed a $120,000 vehicle using my stolen credit profile. No. Ashley whimpered, shaking her head rapidly, her eyes darting between the documents and the federal agents standing just a few feet away. Dad told me to sign those. He said it was just standard corporate paperwork. He said it was for tax purposes. You are 29 years old. I fired back, my voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register that completely silenced her protests. Ignorance is not a legal defense for wire fraud or identity theft. But we both know you were not ignorant. I dropped the final stack of papers directly into Ashley's lap. They were internal corporate emails printed straight from her boutique's main server. These are the encrypted email chains between you and your father from exactly 14 months ago, I stated, speaking loudly enough for the entire room to hear. You were short on capital to secure your spring inventory line from Milan. In this email, you explicitly asked Thomas to, and I quote, pull another advance from the Sabrina account before the useless orphan notices. The entire room sucked in a collective breath. Beatrice Kensington, standing tall behind me, let out a soft, sharp sound of absolute maternal disgust. I looked down at the shattered golden child. You knew exactly where the money was coming from, I said softly. You knew you were bleeding my trust fund dry to finance your fake, glamorous life. You actively authorized fraudulent expenses using my stolen identity because you thought I was too stupid and too beaten down to ever fight back. You thought you were untouchable. Ashley stared at the printed emails resting in her lap. The undeniable proof of her greed, her malice, and her total complicity was sitting right there in black and white. She looked up at me, her mouth working silently, but no words came out. The innocent victim routine was completely dead. The reality of the federal evidence had crushed it into dust. Agent Davis stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She moved past the broken pieces of Thomas's chair and stood directly behind the kneeling bride-to-be. Ashley Vance. Agent Davis said, her voice projecting absolute, unyielding federal authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering. Ashley let out a piercing, terrified scream as Agent Davis grabbed her by the upper arms and hauled her forcefully to her feet. The federal agent did not hesitate or offer any gentleness. She twisted Ashley's wrists behind her back, the cold steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly and loudly over her expensive diamond bracelets. "No, please, Mommy, help me!" Ashley shrieked, kicking her designer heels against the floor as Agent Davis expertly secured her restraints. I am getting married. I cannot go to jail. I am a business owner. You cannot do this to me. The untouchable golden child was completely reduced to a hyperventilating, sobbing mess. The absolute contrast between her custom beaded silk dress and the harsh metal restraints binding her wrists painted a picture of total, undeniable ruin. The elite patrons watching through the frosted glass were whispering furiously. I could see the flashes of their cell phone cameras through the glass, capturing every single humiliating second of the Vance family's very public destruction. They were going to be on the front page of every socialite blog in Chicago before midnight. Linda stood paralyzed against the mahogany wall. Her perfect, affluent world had just been entirely eradicated. She watched her husband, the man who had funded her extravagant lifestyle through deceit for decades, standing in handcuffs with his head bowed in total, irredeemable disgrace. She watched her favorite daughter, the golden child she had groomed for high society dominance, screaming and thrashing in federal custody. Linda's mind raced through the catastrophic wreckage. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her social standing was instantly eradicated. Her biggest allies had walked out the door in disgust. She was going to lose the massive house in the suburbs, the luxury cars, the elite club memberships, the expensive clothes. Everything was gone. Linda slowly slid down the wall. Her knees hit the floor with a dull thud. The sheer panic expanding in her chest stripped away every ounce of her pride, every shred of her arrogance, and every bit of the cruel superiority she had wielded over me for 32 years. She was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was next. Linda crawled forward on her hands and knees, completely ignoring the spilled red wine soaking into her expensive dress. She stopped at the edge of the mahogany table, looking past me, looking past the federal agents. She locked her wide, manic, terrified eyes directly onto Maxwell and Beatrice Kensington. The billionaires stood together, looking down at the ruined woman with expressions of stone-cold fury. "Please," Linda begged, her voice a ragged, desperate rasp. She clutched her hands to her chest, openly sobbing, her dignity entirely abandoned. "Please, Mr. Kensington, you have to stop them. You have to make a deal with me. If you tell them to let my daughter go, if you use your lawyers to protect me from the FBI, I will give you exactly what you want." Maxwell did not move a muscle. He stared down at her with absolute disdain. "You have absolutely nothing I want, Linda." "Yes, I do!" Linda screamed, her voice tearing through the restaurant, raw and desperate. "I know why Sabrina was placed with us. I know it wasn't an accident. If you guarantee me federal immunity, I will tell you who paid us to hide her. I will tell you exactly who orchestrated the kidnapping. I will tell you everything." Thomas's hands clawed the empty air mere inches from my face. His fingers were hooked into rigid, desperate talons as he vaulted across the ruined dining table. He was entirely consumed by a blind, irrational rage, driven by the sudden, terrifying realization that his entire empire of lies had just been incinerated. But before his hands could even graze the fabric of my suit jacket, a blur of dark, impeccably tailored fabric intercepted his violent path. Wyatt Kensington moved with a lethal, calculated speed that was breathtaking to witness. For 32 years, I had been forced to defend myself against the constant emotional and psychological violence of the Vance family entirely alone. Now I watched as my biological brother bypassed his father entirely, stepping seamlessly into the role of my protector. His large, powerful hands clamped down onto Thomas's shoulders like a pair of industrial steel vices. With a single brutal thrust of his arms, Wyatt stopped Thomas's momentum dead in its tracks and shoved the disgraced accountant backward. The sheer force of the push lifted Thomas entirely off his feet for a split second before slamming him violently down into his heavy oak dining chair. The thick wood groaned loudly in protest under the sudden impact, and the chair skidded backward, scraping a harsh, screeching note across the polished hardwood floor. Wyatt did not step back to give the man room to breathe. Instead, he stepped directly into Thomas's personal space, planting his hands firmly on the armrests of the chair, caging the sweating, panicking man completely. Wyatt leaned down until his face was mere inches from Thomas's flushed, blotchy forehead. His presence radiated a quiet, dangerous authority that immediately extinguished the accountant's brief flare of manic anger. "If you ever attempt to lay a single finger on my sister again," Wyatt said, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying glacial fury, "you will quickly discover that federal prison is the absolute least of your problems. Do you understand me? Bankruptcy will feel like a luxury vacation compared to the pain I will personally inflict upon you." Thomas shrank back against the leather upholstery, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. All the bravado and violent temper evaporated, leaving behind only a pathetic, trembling shell. He nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Before Thomas could even attempt to formulate a pathetic apology or regain a shred of his shattered dignity, the heavy frosted glass doors of the private dining room swung open with an undeniable synchronized authority. The subtle, panicked murmurs of the stunned restaurant patrons outside were instantly silenced. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed against the hardwood, cutting through the thick, tense air of the room like a heavy blade. Two men and one woman strode purposefully into the space, their presence immediately dominating the room. They were not restaurant management trying to quell a disturbance, and they certainly were not part of the country club crowd Thomas had spent his life trying to impress. They wore immaculate, nondescript dark suits that screamed government issue. Their expressions were carved from solid granite, completely devoid of any emotion, sympathy, or hesitation. Gold badges glinted prominently beneath their open suit jackets, catching the warm ambient light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. The embezzlement Thomas had orchestrated was not a simple localized matter. Because he had deliberately moved the stolen trust funds across state lines and utilized complex interstate banking networks to funnel the money into his dummy corporations, he had officially crossed the threshold into federal bank fraud. The Kensingtons, utilizing their immense wealth and formidable legal connections, had not just filed a standard police report. They had coordinated a massive, calculated federal strike. Maxwell Kensington had personally arranged for the authorities to act specifically tonight. He had timed the raid perfectly to coincide with my birthday dinner, ensuring that Thomas and Linda would be completely blindsided and publicly humiliated in front of the very society they worshipped. It was a masterclass in poetic justice, executing their total destruction on the exact anniversary of the day they had stolen my life. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp gray eyes and a military haircut, stepped squarely to the head of the table. He did not look at Linda's tear-streaked face, nor did he spare a single glance for Ashley's trembling, ringless hands. His gaze locked entirely onto the sweating, broken man sitting trapped in his chair. Thomas Vance, the agent, stated, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute compliance from every single person in the room. I am Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. We are executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. You are being taken into federal custody immediately on multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, tax evasion, and interstate embezzlement. Thomas let out a high, thin wheeze. The remaining blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He looked frantically from the stoic federal agents to the heavy black audit ledger sitting on the table, the irrefutable physical manifestation of his guilt that I had meticulously compiled. He tried to stand, but his knees instantly buckled beneath him. "There is a massive mistake," Thomas stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed pathetically off the mahogany walls. "You cannot do this here, not in front of everyone. I am a respected member of this community. I am a licensed professional. You have been given the wrong information by a bitter, disgruntled dependent. This is a private family dinner." Agent Miller stepped firmly around the table, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He grabbed Thomas by the bicep and hauled him roughly to his feet. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Miller ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation, debate, or delay. Thomas tried to resist, his shoulders twitching as a final pathetic display of defiance, but Miller expertly twisted his arm, forcing him to comply instantly. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly shut around Thomas's wrists echoed loudly through the dining room. It was the unmistakable sound of finality, the sound of a man losing everything he had ever valued. The absolute humiliation of being handcuffed in the middle of an elite 5-star steakhouse finally broke his spirit completely. He hung his head, his chin resting on his chest, openly weeping as the reality of a federal prison sentence washed over him. Linda could not process the sight of her husband being treated like a common criminal. The facade of the elegant, untouchable suburban socialite completely disintegrated. She dropped all pretense of dignity and threw herself toward Ashley, grasping wildly at her daughter's custom silk dress, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric. Ashley, Linda shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical, ear-piercing pitch that caused the federal agents to wince in unified irritation. Ashley, do something. Call Richard Sterling. Call the law firm right now. Tell them they have to get down here immediately. They cannot arrest your father. We need an emergency injunction. Get your phone out right now and call the lawyers. We need to stop this. But Ashley was not listening to her mother's frantic screaming. Ashley had already grabbed her smartphone from the table, intending to dial the number her mother demanded, but she suddenly went completely pale. Her hands were shaking so violently that the expensive diamond-encrusted device nearly slipped from her fingers. She was staring down at her glowing screen, her eyes wide, her pupils dilated in absolute, unadulterated horror. She was staring at her luxury boutique's primary business banking application. The screen was flashing bright red, displaying a series of urgent catastrophic error codes indicating 0 available balances and locked routing numbers. The notification alerts were cascading down her screen in real time, showing thousands of dollars in automated vendor payments bouncing and failing. The second federal agent, a sharp-eyed woman who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward and addressed the panicking young woman. "Yes, Miss Vance," the agent stated, her voice laced with cold professional satisfaction. "You will find that your business accounts are currently inaccessible. As part of this federal operation, we have initiated a blanket freeze on all assets connected to the fraudulent accounts managed by your father. That includes the initial seed money, the operating capital, and the payroll accounts for your luxury boutique." Ashley let out a tiny, whimpering gasp, shaking her head in denial as she tapped furiously at the frozen screen. "Every single dollar you used to fund your business," the agent continued mercilessly, "was traced directly back to the stolen trust funds. Your father utilized embezzled capital to establish your commercial presence. Therefore, your imported inventory, your storefront lease, and your commercial checking accounts have all been seized by the federal government pending a full criminal investigation. You currently have absolutely no assets." Ashley dropped her phone. The device hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, the screen splintering into a spiderweb of broken glass, but she did not even blink. The devastating reality of the situation slammed into her all at once, shattering her perfectly curated world into a million jagged pieces. Bradley was gone. Her multi-million-dollar engagement was dead. Her father was going to federal prison. Her luxury business was seized by the government. Her bank accounts were frozen. She was entirely irreversibly ruined, stripped of her golden child status, and her stolen wealth in a matter of seconds. She had spent her entire life looking down on me, mocking my cheap clothes and my grueling work ethic while parading around in luxury financed entirely by my stolen inheritance. Now she was left with absolutely nothing. Ashley slowly raised her head and looked directly at her weeping mother. The golden child's face twisted into an expression of pure, venomous hatred. She balled her manicured hands into tight fists, her body trembling with a rage that eclipsed everything else in the room. The alliance they had maintained to torment me for decades instantly dissolved under the pressure of federal consequences. "You ruined my life!" Ashley screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice tearing through the restaurant as she lunged toward her own mother. "You ruined everything." The sheer volume of Linda's desperate scream reverberated off the thick mahogany paneling, freezing every single person in the private dining room. Agent Miller and Agent Davis stopped dead in their tracks, their grips tightening instinctively on the shoulders of the handcuffed, sobbing father and daughter duo. The ambient noise from the main restaurant beyond the frosted glass seemed to vanish entirely, sucked out of the room by the massive vacuum of Linda's explosive claim. Maxwell Kensington went completely rigid. Beside him, Beatrice stumbled back a half step, her hand flying to her mouth. For 32 agonizing years, they had lived with a specific haunting narrative. They had been told, and had thoroughly believed, that their infant daughter was snatched by random opportunistic strangers in a chaotic, tragic crime of opportunity. The idea that this was an orchestrated, paid hit completely shattered the foundation of their decades-long grief. Linda, still kneeling on the wine-soaked hardwood floor, saw the profound, visceral shock drain the color from the billionaires' faces. In her twisted, narcissistic mind, she immediately mistook their silent horror for a sudden shift in power. Her survival instinct flared to life. She thought she possessed the ultimate trump card, the one piece of information that could salvage her ruined existence. She scrambled to her feet, wiping the running mascara from her cheeks with the back of her trembling hand, her posture shifting from a begging victim to a desperate extortionist. "Tell them to let my husband go!" Linda demanded, her voice losing its frantic edge and taking on a sickening, calculating tone of negotiation. "Tell the FBI to drop the charges against Ashley right now. I want total blanket federal immunity for my entire family. I want every single bank account you froze today reinstated immediately. Do that, Maxwell, and I will give you the name. I will tell you exactly who approached us, who orchestrated the falsified adoption papers, and who paid us to make your daughter disappear forever. If you want the truth about your precious little girl, you have to buy it from me." She stood there, her chest heaving, waiting for the billionaire to bow to her demands. She genuinely believed she had cornered one of the most powerful men in Chicago. I did not give Maxwell Kensington the opportunity to respond. I stepped forward, putting myself directly between my biological parents and the woman who had tormented me for my entire existence. "You really do not understand the situation you are in, Linda," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying surgical calm that echoed through the dead silence of the room. "You do not have leverage. You do not have a trump card. You have absolutely nothing to bargain with." Linda blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by my intervention. "You cannot speak to me like that. I have the name. I am the only one who knows the truth. You are a financially illiterate narcissist who spent 32 years underestimating an auditor," I replied coldly. "I did not just track the millions you and Thomas stole from my trust fund this year. When I gained access to Thomas's secure offshore banking network to build the embezzlement case, I went all the way back to the beginning. I went back to 1994. Linda's jaw dropped. The last remnants of color fled her face as she stared at me in mounting terror. I reached into the leather portfolio resting on the table and pulled out a single heavily redacted bank statement sealed inside a clear plastic evidence sleeve. I held it up so the harsh light of the chandelier caught the crisp white paper. "It takes an immense amount of capital to buy a child, arrange ironclad forged adoption papers, and permanently seal a false identity," I explained, pacing slowly toward her. "Thomas was a low-level accountant back then. He did not have that kind of money. But a massive, untraceable wire transfer of $2.5 million hit a shell account in the Cayman Islands exactly 3 days before I was officially placed into your custody. It took me 4 months of aggressive forensic accounting to crack the routing encryption, but I traced every single cent back to its original source. I tracked it through a dummy corporation in Luxembourg and tied it directly to a private wealth fund managed by a Kensington family subsidiary." I stopped right in front of Linda. She was shaking so violently her teeth were chattering. "I do not need you to give me the name to solve a mystery, Linda," I said, leaning in close. My eyes locked onto hers. "I already know exactly who did it. I have the wire transfer receipts. I have the encrypted emails between Thomas and the architect of this crime. I have the complete digital footprint of the entire conspiracy. I just want to hear you say her name. Say it out loud in front of the parents she destroyed. Tell them who paid you." Linda looked at the bank statement in my hand. She looked at the federal agents who were watching her with predatory, uncompromising intensity. Her leverage was gone. Her grand negotiation was dead. She was completely, inescapably trapped. She slumped forward, defeated, her shoulders dropping as the final fight drained out of her body. "It was Carol," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Ashley's ragged sobbing. "Say it louder," I commanded, my tone completely unforgiving. "It was Carol," Linda cried out, fresh tears spilling down her face as she looked toward Beatrice. "It was your sister Beatrice. Aunt Carol paid us." A collective suffocating gasp swept through the room. Beatrice Kensington let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, her knees buckling beneath her as the absolute horror of the revelation struck her. Maxwell caught his wife, wrapping his strong arms tightly around her waist to keep her upright, but his own face was a mask of absolute, paralyzing disbelief. "She approached Thomas at a charity gala right after you announced you were pregnant," Linda confessed rapidly, the words spilling from her mouth like a broken dam as she sought to shift the blame. She hated you, Beatrice. She hated that your side of the family controlled the majority voting shares of the Kensington Empire. She knew that if you had a healthy baby, that child would immediately become the primary heir to the entire corporate dynasty. She wanted her own son, Preston, to inherit the controlling stake. She could not stand the thought of your child taking what she believed belonged to Preston. Linda pointed a trembling finger at the floor, unable to look the devastated mother in the eye. Carol paid Thomas $2.5 million in untraceable offshore funds. She hired the private security contractors who took Sabrina from the park. She arranged for the corrupt judge who signed off on the falsified closed adoption records. She orchestrated the entire thing so Preston would be the only heir left standing. We were just the holding cell. We were just paid to hide her in plain sight. She promised us we would be taken care of for the rest of our lives if we kept our mouths shut. The magnitude of the betrayal was almost too massive to comprehend. Beatrice buried her face in her husband's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The monster who had stolen her baby was not a stranger lurking in an alleyway. It was her own sister. The woman who had comforted her, who had cried with her at the candlelight vigils, who had attended every single family holiday for the last 32 years, while secretly knowing exactly where the stolen child was suffering in poverty and emotional abuse. Maxwell Kensington's initial shock vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, calculated, and terrifying fury. His eyes turned completely flat, his jaw setting into a rigid line of pure destructive intent. The grieving father was gone, replaced entirely by a ruthless corporate titan, ready to annihilate anyone who had harmed his family. Wyatt Kensington stood frozen near the shattered dining chair. He stared blankly at the wall as his entire childhood narrative was violently rewritten in his mind. Aunt Carol, the woman who had bought him his first bicycle, the aunt who smiled at him across the Thanksgiving table and wiped his tears when he scraped his knee. The cousin Preston, whom he had treated like a brother and a confidant. His entire existence, his entire family dynamic, had been built on a foundation of pure malicious lies orchestrated by his own flesh and blood. The protective rage that had fueled Wyatt all evening suddenly sharpened into a lethal, terrifying focus. He did not say a word to his weeping mother or his furious father. He did not look at the ruined Vance family being held by federal agents. Wyatt simply turned on his heel, took 3 large strides toward the corner of the room, and pulled his smartphone from his suit pocket. He dialed a secure number, his dark eyes scanning the room with the predatory focus of a hunting hawk. He was calling the head of the Kensington Private Security Detail. I watched his reflection in the frosted glass as he issued rapid, clipped orders to locate Aunt Carol and Preston immediately. He instructed his men to lock down every private airfield, freeze their corporate access cards, and drag them back to the estate for an immediate reckoning. Wyatt listened to the response from his security chief for exactly 5 seconds. His rigid posture suddenly shifted. His hand slowly lowered the phone from his ear. He ended the call, sliding the device back into his pocket with deliberate, agonizing slowness. He turned around to face the room. The absolute deafening silence returned, broken only by the muffled sounds of Ashley crying in handcuffs and the sharp, shallow breaths of Linda Vance. Wyatt looked directly at his mother and father. His expression was a terrifying mixture of anticipation and cold, hard justice. "Security does not need to look far," Wyatt announced, his deep voice cutting through the heavy air with chilling clarity. "Carol and Preston are walking into the restaurant right now. They told the front desk they came to surprise you for dinner." The heavy frosted glass doors glided open on their brass hinges before the echo of Wyatt's words could even settle. The maitre d' stepped aside, nervously gesturing into the room, unwittingly ushering the architects of my destruction straight into the slaughterhouse. Carol Kensington stepped across the threshold first. She was a vision of aging high society elegance, draped in a cream cashmere coat with a silk scarf tied perfectly at her neck. Her face was lifted into a radiant manufactured smile designed to command any room she entered. Right behind her sauntered Preston, the golden heir apparent. He wore a bespoke navy suit that cost more than my first car, holding a chilled bottle of vintage Dom Perignon by the neck like a trophy. Surprise Carol sang out her voice, a melodious trill that abruptly snagged and died in her throat. The tableau before them was a masterpiece of absolute ruin. Thomas and Ashley Vance were pressed against the wall, their arms contorted behind their backs, the heavy steel of federal handcuffs glinting under the crystal chandeliers. Linda Vance was a crumpled, sobbing heap on the wine-stained floor, her mascara running in thick black rivers down her cheeks. Two imposing federal agents stood like statues flanking the disgraced family. And in the center of it all stood Maxwell Beatrice Wyatt and myself. Preston stopped dead. The smug, entitled grin vanished from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of sheer bewilderment. He lowered the champagne bottle slowly. Carol, however, possessed the terrifying, practiced reflexes of a true sociopath. After a microsecond of genuine shock, the mask of the loving, concerned sister snapped flawlessly back into place. Beatrice Maxwell, what on earth is happening here? Carol gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. She stepped forward expertly, ignoring the federal agents and the handcuffed Vances, focusing entirely on her sister. We just wanted to surprise you for a celebratory dinner. Are you hurt? Who are these people? Beatrice Kensington did not move to embrace her sister. She stood completely rigid, trembling from the inside out, her eyes locked onto the woman she had trusted her entire life. 32 years of shared tears, 32 years of holding hands at candlelight vigils, 32 years of Carol playing the supportive shoulder to cry on. All of it was incinerating right before her eyes. How could you? Beatrice whispered, her voice a hollow, shattered rasp that carried more weight than a scream. My own sister. Carol stopped her advance. She tilted her head, her expression transforming into a picture of perfect, innocent confusion. Beatrice, darling, what are you talking about? You are shaking. Has something happened? Maxwell stepped slightly in front of his wife, his massive frame shielding her. Linda Vance just confessed, Carol Maxwell stated, his voice a low, vibrating growl of pure homicidal intent. She told us exactly how they got our daughter. She told us who paid them the $2.5 million to kidnap her and forge the closed adoption records. She told us everything. Carol did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. She let out a short, breathy laugh of total disbelief, shaking her head as if Maxwell had just told a deeply offensive joke. Maxwell, please tell me you are not actually listening to this absolute lunatic, Carol said, gesturing dismissively toward Linda, who was still rocking back and forth on the floor. Look at this woman. Look at this entire scene. Her husband is literally in federal handcuffs. Her daughter is in handcuffs. She is obviously a desperate, cornered criminal making up wild, psychotic lies to save her own skin. You cannot possibly believe a word coming out of her mouth. Preston immediately stepped up beside his mother, puffing out his chest, radiating the arrogant indignation of a man who believed his wealth made him completely untouchable. This is completely absurd, Preston scoffed, glaring at Maxwell and Wyatt. You are taking the word of some suburban grifter over your own flesh and blood. Aunt Beatrice's mom has been by your side every single day since the kidnapping. She funded the private investigators. She organized the reward money. To even entertain this accusation is incredibly insulting to our entire family. Carol pressed her advantage, taking another step toward her sister, her voice dripping with manufactured empathy. Beatrice, they are just trying to manipulate your grief. They know how desperate you are to find your little girl, and they are using that pain to drag us down with them. You know me. I would never ever do anything to hurt you. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the lie hung in the air. Wyatt took a threatening step forward, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles were white, fully prepared to physically remove Preston and Carol from the room. But I raised my hand, stopping Wyatt in his tracks. You cannot outscream a gaslighter, and you cannot appeal to the conscience of a sociopath. You simply bury them under a mountain of undeniable data. You are incredibly good at this. Carol, I said, stepping out from behind Maxwell and Beatrice to face the woman who had orchestrated my lifetime of misery. Your performance is flawless, but I am a forensic auditor. I do not care about your tears, and I certainly do not care about your indignant protests. I only care about the math. I calmly reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy folder. This was not the preliminary packet I had used to destroy Thomas. This was the master file, the culmination of 4 months of relentless, obsessive tracking through the darkest corners of international finance. Carol's eyes darted toward the folder, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch of panic betraying her calm facade. Linda did not just give us a name, I stated, my voice echoing with clinical detached authority. Linda merely confirmed what I already knew. You see, when I cracked Thomas's current dummy corporations to expose his embezzlement, I found a deeply buried legacy account. It was an account he opened in 1994, the exact same year I was abducted. I opened the folder and extracted a stack of unredacted certified bank statements. I walked straight up to Carol and shoved the papers directly into her hands. She reflexively grabbed them, her gaze dropping to the numbers printed on the top page. I tracked the initial deposit. I continued speaking clearly so the federal agents could hear every single word. $2.5 million. It did not come from a local bank. It came from a highly encrypted offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a shell company named Azure Holdings. Preston swallowed hard, the champagne bottle in his hand trembling slightly. The smugness was completely gone from his face. Back in 1994, offshore accounts were practically black holes, I explained, pacing slowly around Carol and Preston, circling them like prey. You could hide anything there. You could move millions of dollars in hush money to a corrupt accountant, buy a kidnapped child, fund fake adoption papers, and nobody would ever be able to trace it back to you. You thought you committed the perfect untraceable crime. Carol stared at the paper, her breathing growing shallow. These are just numbers, she whispered defensively, her voice losing its melodic trill. This proves absolutely nothing. Azure Holdings could belong to anyone. You are fabricating connections. I am not fabricating anything, I fired back, my voice hardening into steel. You are right about one thing. 30 years ago, Azure Holdings was an anonymous black box, but the global banking system evolved, Carol. International transparency laws changed, the Patriot Act happened, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act happened, the banking world modernized, and those anonymous offshore accounts were eventually forced to integrate with modern digital banking systems to remain active. I reached over and tapped my index finger hard against the second page in her hands. When Azure Holdings was forced to digitize its legacy records 10 years ago to comply with new international tax regulations, the original founding documents had to be scanned and entered into the global registry. I said, leaning in so close I could smell her expensive perfume. I bypassed the encryption on that registry yesterday morning. I pulled the original articles of incorporation for the shell company that paid Thomas Vance to ruin my life. Carol froze completely. The paper in her hands was shaking so violently that it made a loud rustling sound in the quiet room. Preston was staring at his mother, his eyes wide with rising panic, waiting for her to talk her way out of this, waiting for her to deploy another masterful lie. But there were no more lies left to tell. I smiled at Carol, a cold, predatory expression that offered absolutely no mercy. You hid the money well, Carol, but you forgot that offshore accounts eventually merge with modern digital banking. Your signature is on the transfer. Carol stared down at the crisp, unforgiving white paper in her trembling hands. The black ink of her own signature from 3 decades ago glared back at her, an absolute, irrefutable death warrant for her pristine social standing and her limitless wealth. The silence in the VIP dining room was suffocating, heavy with the toxic weight of her exposed sins. Preston leaned over his mother's shaking shoulder, his jaw going slack. His eyes frantically tracked the routing numbers, the dates, the undeniable sum of $2.5 million, and finally, the signature. The blood drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he had turned to stone. His entire identity, his monumental arrogance, his entire reality was built on the singular foundation of being the sole, undisputed heir to the Kensington global empire. He had spent his entire life spending money that did not belong to him, wielding unearned corporate power, and mocking anyone beneath his astronomical tax bracket. The realization that the woman standing across from him was the true heir, the legitimate owner of the billions he had planned to inherit, completely short-circuited his mind. Preston looked from the damning documents directly to me. The sheer, unadulterated panic in his eyes morphed instantly into a chaotic, feral violence. In his highly privileged, deeply insulated reality, problems disappeared when you threw enough money at them, or failing that when you simply destroyed the evidence. His pampered brain genuinely believed that if he could just rip those specific pieces of paper into shreds, the nightmare would abruptly end. The truth would magically vanish. He would remain the billionaire heir apparent, and I would be erased once again. His fingers flexed involuntarily. The heavy vintage bottle of Dom Perignon slipped from his grasp. It hit the mahogany floor with a concussive shatter, sending a wave of pale green glass and foaming expensive alcohol spraying across the polished wood. "Give me those papers!" Preston roared, his voice cracking with hysterical, blind desperation. He shoved his own mother aside, sending Carol stumbling hard against the wood-paneled wall, and launched himself directly across the room at me. His hands were outstretched, his face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious intent. He was not just trying to take the documents. He wanted to physically hurt me. He wanted to violently silence the woman who was systematically dismantling his stolen empire. I did not even flinch. I stood my ground, my eyes locked dead on the charging, pathetic air. I knew with absolute certainty he would never reach me. Wyatt Kensington moved with the lethal precision of a guided missile. The protective rage that had been building inside my biological brother since Linda's initial sickening confession finally detonated. Wyatt stepped directly into Preston's violent path, pivoting his broad shoulder at the exact millisecond of impact. He caught Preston perfectly in the center of his chest. The dull, sickening thud of bone against bone echoed sharply through the dining room. Preston's forward momentum was instantly and violently redirected into a breathless, stumbling retreat. Before Preston could even attempt to catch his balance or regain his footing, the double doors of the private dining room burst completely open. Two massive restaurant security guards, drawn by the sound of shattering glass and Preston's hysterical screaming, charged into the fray. Wyatt did not wait for their assistance, but he utilized their sudden presence flawlessly. He grabbed Preston by the lapels of his custom-tailored bespoke navy suit, twisted his body with brutal efficiency, and slammed the golden child face first into the floor. The two security guards instantly dropped their combined weight onto Preston's thrashing limbs. They pinned his arms forcefully behind his back, pressing their knees heavily into his spine with uncompromising authority. "Get off me!" Preston screamed, thrashing wildly and pathetically against the floorboards, his face pressing directly into the sticky puddle of spilled champagne and jagged broken glass. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am Preston Kensington. I own half the city. I will buy this restaurant and personally ensure every single one of you never works again. Get your hands off me right now." "You do not own a single thing, Preston," Wyatt growled, kneeling beside his cousin. His voice a low, terrifying rumble that instantly silenced Preston's frantic, entitled threats. "You are a complete fraud. Your entire life is a manufactured lie financed by a violent kidnapping. You stole my sister. You watched my parents grieve in agony for 32 years while you happily spent her inheritance. If you say one more word, if you make one more move toward her, I will tell these guards to step back and I will handle you myself." Preston went completely still, his chest heaving against the wet floor. The stark reality of Wyatt's physical dominance and the absolute, unyielding fury burning in his eyes finally broke through Preston's panicked delusion. The golden boy was completely defeated, pinned to the floor like a common street thug. Maxwell Kensington stepped forward. The patriarch of the Kensington Empire looked down at his restrained nephew, his face a portrait of devastating betrayal and icy, calculating resolve. He then turned his intense, terrifying gaze to his sister-in-law. Carol had pressed herself completely flat against the mahogany wall. Her trembling hands were covering her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for an exit, searching for an ally, searching for any possible lie that could magically extract her from this catastrophic reality. There was nowhere to run. The walls were rapidly closing in. Carol Maxwell said, his voice entirely stripped of all familial warmth, echoing with the absolute authority of a corporate executioner. 32 years. You sat at our dining table. You held Beatrice while she cried herself to sleep. You watched me tear this city apart, utilizing every resource I possessed, searching for my daughter. And you knew. You paid to have my child thrown away like garbage just so your son could take her place. Carol shook her head rapidly, tears of absolute selfish terror streaming down her expertly contoured face. Maxwell, please, you have to understand my position. I was terrified. Beatrice was going to inherit the voting majority of the company. I just wanted to protect my own family's legacy. I just wanted Preston to have what he rightfully deserved. I did not want her dead. I swear to you, I just wanted her gone. You paid a fraudster to steal an infant, I stated, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with my biological father. I looked at the pathetic, crumbling socialite with total disgust. You funded the falsification of federal adoption documents. You initiated an interstate wire transfer to deliberately hide the hush money. You did not protect a legacy, Carol. You committed a massive, highly coordinated federal crime. And unlike Thomas Vance, you do not even have the pathetic excuse of being broke. You did it entirely out of pure, unadulterated, malicious greed. Beatrice. Kensington stepped forward, her posture finally rigid, her tears of sorrow entirely replaced by a maternal fury that was awe-inspiring to witness. You are no longer my sister, Beatrice stated, her voice slicing through the room like a surgical scalpel. You are nothing to me. You are nothing to this family. You will rot in a federal cell for the rest of your miserable life, and I will personally ensure that not a single dime of Kensington money ever goes toward your legal defense. You are entirely on your own. The two federal agents, Agent Miller and Agent Davis, had remained perfectly professionally still during the violent confrontation, maintaining their iron grips on Thomas and Ashley Vance. They had watched the entire chaotic spectacle unfold with analytical precision. They had heard Linda's hysterical, detailed confession. They had watched me hand over the unredacted bank statements proving the offshore wire transfer and the kidnapping payoff. They had witnessed Preston's desperate attempt to destroy federal evidence and his subsequent physical assault. The federal trap, initially set and calculated only for the Vance family's financial crimes, had suddenly and dramatically expanded to capture a much larger, much wealthier prey. Agent Miller handed Thomas Vance off to a third agent, who had quietly slipped into the room to assist with the arrests. Miller adjusted his suit jacket, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unyielding government authority. He walked slowly past Linda, who was still weeping silently on the floor, and stepped directly in front of the paralyzed, hyperventilating socialite. Carol stared up at the tall federal agent. The sheer, insurmountable power of the United States government radiated from his formidable stance. He was not a private security guard she could easily bribe. He was not a restaurant manager she could arrogantly intimidate. He was the absolute, undeniable end of her elite, privileged existence. Carol Kensington, Agent Miller stated, his deep voice carrying absolute finality. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound made Carol flinch violently. No, Carol whimpered, raising her trembling hands defensively, her voice dropping to a pathetic, begging whisper. Please, you do not understand. This is a private family matter. We can settle this privately. I have money. I have resources. We can make full restitution. Please do not do this. This ceased being a private family matter the exact second you wired $2.5 million across international borders to facilitate the abduction of a minor, Agent Miller replied. He grabbed her wrist, ignoring her protests, and twisted it firmly behind her back. Agent Davis stepped forward, leaving Ashley Vance sobbing pathetically against the wall. She walked over to where Preston was still pinned to the floor by the security guards. She hauled him roughly to his feet, completely ignoring his arrogant protests and indignant shouting as she slammed his wrists into a pair of tight metal handcuffs. The lead agent looks at Carol and Preston. Kidnapping, interstate wire fraud, and tax evasion. You're both coming with us. The finality of the federal agent's words struck the room like a physical blow. Preston Kensington, a man who had never faced a single consequence in his 32 years of pampered existence, let out a choked, guttural sound of pure panic. He twisted violently against the firm grip of Agent Davis, his expensive designer shoes slipping uselessly against the champagne-soaked floorboards. The two restaurant security guards immediately reinforced the federal agent hauling the thrashing heir upright with zero regard for the ruined fabric of his bespoke suit or the absolute terror radiating from his wide eyes. Across the room, Carol Kensington was entirely stripped of her high society armor. The woman who had spent decades reigning over Chicago's elite philanthropic circles was reduced to a hyperventilating handcuffed prisoner pressed against the mahogany paneling. The heavy steel biting into her wrists was a stark physical manifestation of her destroyed empire. She looked frantically toward Maxwell, her eyes begging for the familial leniency that had shielded her entire life. She found absolutely nothing but an arctic, unforgiving void in her brother-in-law's stare. "Wait," Maxwell commanded, raising a single authoritative hand as Agent Miller moved to escort the disgraced socialites out of the private dining room. "Just one moment, Agent Miller. I have a piece of family business to conclude before you remove these two from my sight permanently." Agent Miller paused. He respected the power and the precision of the man who had facilitated this entire federal operation. He gave a sharp nod, stepping back just enough to allow the billionaire patriarch access to the prisoners, while keeping his hand firmly wrapped around Carol's upper arm. Maxwell did not shout. He did not lose his temper. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit coat and extracted a thick, folded legal document printed on heavy, watermarked parchment. He stepped slowly toward Carol and Preston, his demeanor shifting entirely from a grieving father to the ruthless, calculating chairman of the Kensington Global Conglomerate. He stopped in front of the ruined mother and son, looking down at them with a disgust so profound it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "When Sabrina came to me earlier today with the forensic evidence of your monumental treason, I did not just call the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Maxwell stated, his voice a low vibrating hum of absolute devastation. "I also called the board of directors and the primary trustees of the Kensington Family Holding Corporation. I convened an emergency executive session while you were busy selecting which vintage champagne you were going to bring to this dinner." Preston stopped struggling. A new, entirely different kind of terror washed over his face as he stared at the heavy parchment in his uncle's hand. "As the founder and majority stakeholder of this empire, I have unilateral authority over the distribution of Class A voting shares and the structure of our family trusts." Maxwell continued, meticulously unfolding the document. "Section 4 of our corporate charter clearly dictates that any shareholder indicted for a felony against the primary family instantly forfeits their voting rights, their dividends, and their equity position. You did not just steal my daughter Carol. You initiated a hostile criminal action against the very foundation of this family." Carol shook her head rapidly, her breath catching in her throat. "Maxwell, no, you cannot do this. You cannot strip us of our shares. It is my life's work. It is Preston's entire future. We are Kensington's." "You are felons." Maxwell corrected, his tone completely flat, entirely devoid of mercy. "And as of an hour ago, you are entirely bankrupt." Maxwell held the document up so the harsh light of the chandeliers illuminated the thick black text and the freshly stamped corporate seals. "By the authority vested in me, I have officially executed a complete and total termination of your financial existence." Maxwell declared, his words striking Carol like physical blows. "Your shares in Kensington Holdings have been revoked and reclaimed by the primary estate. Your access to the family trust has been permanently severed. Every single corporate credit card, every expense account, and every property deed held in your names through the subsidiary shell companies has been frozen, seized, and transferred back to the holding group. You have absolutely nothing. You will face a federal judge tomorrow morning with the assets of a public defender." Preston let out a high, ragged shriek of pure denial. "You cannot take my money. It is mine. I am the heir. I am the next chairman. You cannot leave me with nothing. You are leaving with exactly what you earned." Maxwell fired back, his voice finally cracking like a whip, snapping Preston's hysterical protests in half. "You are leaving with the clothes on your back and federal charges that will put you in a concrete cell until you are an old, forgotten man." Maxwell did not spare them another second of his time. He turned his back on the screaming heir and the sobbing socialite, walking slowly toward the center of the room where I stood next to Beatrice and Wyatt. The ruthless, calculating corporate titan melted away with every step he took. By the time he stopped in front of me, he was just a father looking at the daughter he had spent a lifetime mourning. He placed the thick legal document down on the pristine, unblemished end of the long dining table. He reached into his pocket, retrieved a heavy gold monogrammed fountain pen, and quickly signed his name on the final blank line at the bottom of the page. He then turned the document around and slid it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of me. I looked down at the parchment. It was not just a document revoking Carol and Preston's wealth, it was a formal, legally binding transfer of assets. 32 years ago, they stole your life, your identity, and your rightful place in this family. Maxwell said, his voice thick with an overwhelming, entirely unrestrained emotion. I cannot give you back the years you suffered in that house. I cannot erase the pain they inflicted upon you. But I can ensure that you are restored to your exact rightful position in this world. Beatrice stepped forward, tears streaming freely down her face, and placed her hand gently over mine. This document formally reinstates you as Sabrina Kensington Maxwell explained, tapping the paper. It immediately transfers every single share, every trust account, and every corporate asset previously held by Carol and Preston directly into your name. You are not just my daughter. You are now the undisputed majority shareholder and the primary heir to the entire Kensington empire. It is yours. It always was. I stared at the document, the sheer magnitude of the wealth and power transferring into my hands, washing over me in a massive, surreal wave. Wyatt stepped up to my right side, placing a strong protective hand on my shoulder, solidifying the united front of my true family. The contrast between the immense unconditional love radiating from the Kensingtons and the cold transactional cruelty I had endured my entire life was staggering. But the profound emotional weight of the moment was abruptly and jarringly shattered by a sound that defied all logic, all reason, and all basic human decency. A loud, nervous clearing of a throat echoed from the corner of the room. Everyone, including the hardened federal agents, turned their heads in absolute disbelief. Thomas Vance, standing with his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his face bruised and pale from his impending federal prison sentence, had physically leaned forward. His eyes were locked greedily onto the transfer document sitting on the table. The astronomical numbers he had surely overheard had completely overridden his sense of self-preservation. "Excuse me," Thomas stammered, his voice carrying that familiar, sickeningly arrogant tone of a man trying to negotiate a business deal. "I mean, obviously mistakes were made, terrible mistakes. But we need to look at the reality of the situation here." Linda Vance, still kneeling on the floor with her makeup smeared and her elegant dress ruined, suddenly perked up. The mention of millions of dollars acting like a shot of adrenaline straight into her narcissistic veins. She scrambled to her feet, moving to stand awkwardly beside her handcuffed husband, nodding in rapid agreement. "Exactly," Linda chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate, as she looked directly at Maxwell and Beatrice. "You have to admit we did you a massive favor. If Carol had handed Sabrina over to anyone else, who knows what would have happened to her? She could have ended up dead. She could have been put into a terrible foster home. But we took her in. We put a roof over her head. We fed her. We clothed her. We kept her alive for 32 years. The entire room stared at them in a state of collective, paralyzing shock. The sheer, unfathomable audacity required to demand compensation after being arrested for kidnapping, wire fraud, and identity theft was a level of sociopathic greed that bordered on the psychotic. Thomas puffed out his chest, ignoring the federal agent gripping his shoulder. "We raised your daughter, Mr. Kensington. We provided the environment that allowed her to become this brilliant forensic auditor. You are transferring billions of dollars to her today. Given the fact that we preserved her life and protected your investment, it is only fair that we receive a percentage of that wealth. We are legally and morally entitled to a finder's fee, a settlement for our decades of custodial services. 10% of the transferred assets would be a reasonable and appropriate compensation." Agent Miller actually let out a low whistle of pure disbelief. Wyatt took a deep breath, looking as though he was debating whether to physically throw Thomas through the frosted glass doors. But I did not feel anger. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of their emotional abuse. I looked at Thomas and Linda Vance, the two people who had stolen my childhood, destroyed my trust, and treated me like a worthless financial burden for over 3 decades. I looked at their greedy, desperate faces, expecting a payout while standing in federal handcuffs. I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a bitter laugh or a forced sarcastic chuckle. It was a loud, bright, genuinely amused sound that echoed off the mahogany walls and completely unnerved the Vance family. The sheer absurdity of their delusion was the funniest thing I had ever witnessed. I stopped laughing and let the silence stretch for a long, terrifying moment. I picked up my gold pen, signed my name with a flourish at the bottom of the Kensington transfer document, and then turned my body to face Thomas and Linda completely. "You want a finder's fee?" I asked, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "Let's calculate exactly what you've earned." The sheer absurdity of Thomas Vance's demand hung in the air, a testament to a lifetime of unchecked narcissism and breathtaking delusion. He was standing in a ruined private dining room, his wrists bound in federal steel, his entire criminal conspiracy exposed to the billionaires he had defrauded, and his first instinct was to negotiate a payout. I looked at his bruised, sweating face, and the last residual shred of the frightened, subservient girl I used to be evaporated completely. "Let us start with the principal amount," I said, my voice cutting through the silence with the sharp, unforgiving precision of a scalpel. I unclasped the secondary latch on my leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, spiral-bound forensic ledger. I dropped it onto the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a heavy, resounding thud. "For the past 4 months, while you thought I was working late at my accounting firm, I was meticulously unwinding the labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts you created. I tracked every single fraudulent transfer you authorized from the Kensington Trust Fund to finance your pathetic imitation of a wealthy lifestyle." Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the black ledger. "Over the last 7 years, you systematically embezzled $1.8 million directly from my trust assets," I stated, opening the ledger to the first tabbed section. "You utilized my stolen identity to secure commercial loans, circumventing the banking alerts by utilizing your credentials as a certified public accountant. You funneled $300,000 to secure the lease and inventory for Ashley's luxury boutique. You diverted $200,000 to purchase your custom luxury vehicles. You spent over $400,000 funding Linda's country club memberships, her European vacations, and her cosmetic procedures." Linda let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her throat as her precious guarded secrets were laid bare in front of Chicago's elite. "You stole $1.8 million in hard capital," I continued, my gaze fixed firmly on Thomas. "But as an accountant, you know that money does not exist in a vacuum. You robbed that trust of its earning potential. When we apply the standard market growth rate and compound interest over the duration of your active theft, the lost capital gains amount to an additional $900,000. "That is ridiculous," Thomas sputtered, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "You cannot legally enforce market speculation on a restitution claim. Any judge would throw that out. A federal judge will not throw out the IRS penalties for tax evasion, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft." I fired back, my voice rising in power, dominating the space. "You failed to report the embezzled funds as income, which triggers federal tax evasion charges. You utilized my social security number to open credit lines, which triggers statutory damages for identity theft under federal law. When we calculate the mandatory federal fraud penalties, the IRS back taxes the punitive damages and the compounded interest on the stolen principal. The grand total comes to exactly $4.2 million. Thomas sagged against the grip of the federal agent holding him. He knew the math was flawless. He knew he was utterly destroyed. $4.2 million. Linda repeated, her voice a hollow, terrified whisper. Her manicured hands shook violently. "We do not have $4 million. You know we do not have that kind of liquid cash. The bank accounts are frozen. How are we supposed to pay that?" "You are not going to pay it, Linda," I said, a cold, satisfied smile touching my lips. I am going to take it. Linda's eyes widened in absolute horror. What do you mean? I did not just bring this forensic audit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I explained, stepping closer to the ruined woman. I also brought it to the primary lending institutions holding the mortgages and the commercial leases you signed using my stolen identity. Because you committed fraud on the initial applications, every single one of those contracts is null and void. Earlier this week, my legal team filed massive, unyielding commercial liens against every single asset you possess to cover the $4.2 million restitution. Ashley let out a piercing, hysterical sob, pulling uselessly against her handcuffs. My store. You cannot take my store. Your store is currently surrounded by federal agents seizing your imported inventory as proceeds of a crime. I told my former sister, offering her absolutely zero sympathy. And your beloved suburban mansion, Linda. The one you used to host your elite garden parties while making me scrub the floors. The bank foreclosed on it this afternoon. No, Linda shrieked, lunging forward only to be yanked back aggressively by Agent Davis. You cannot do this. That is my home, my clothes, my jewelry. Everything I own is in that house. You own absolutely nothing, I stated, my voice echoing with finality. The bank has already dispatched a property management team. The locks on the suburban mansion were changed at exactly 6 o'clock this evening while you were drinking vintage wine in this restaurant. Your luxury SUVs have already been towed from the valet parking lot outside. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, every single physical asset you mistakenly believed belonged to you will be permanently seized, auctioned, and liquidated to pay back the trust you stole from. The untouchable Vance family was entirely eradicated. Thomas was a weeping, broken shell of a man, his fraudulent empire reduced to ashes. Ashley was hyperventilating her dreams of high society dominance and a multi-million-dollar wedding entirely crushed. Linda was thrashing against the federal agents, screaming incoherently about her designer clothes and her country club status, utterly incapable of grasping the reality that she was going to spend the night in a concrete federal holding cell. Agent Miller looked at me, a flicker of genuine professional respect crossing his stoic features. He then turned his attention back to the 5 prisoners occupying the room. We are done here, Agent Miller announced, his booming voice cutting through the chaotic sobbing. Transport them to the federal building downtown. We will process them for holding. The federal agents moved with swift, uncompromising authority. They did not care about the expensive suits, the designer dresses, or the shattered egos of the people they were arresting. They hauled Thomas and Ashley Vance roughly toward the double-glass doors. Linda fought them every step of the way, dragging her high heels against the floor, sobbing and begging for someone to call a lawyer she could no longer afford. Right behind them, another team of agents grabbed Carol and Preston Kensington. The absolute humiliation of the moment finally seemed to penetrate Preston's arrogant skull. He was being grouped together with the very suburban grifters his mother had hired. He was no longer the golden heir to a global conglomerate. He was just another handcuffed felon being paraded out of a restaurant. He hung his head, trying desperately to hide his face from the blinding flashes of the cell phone cameras, waiting just outside the private room. Carol Kensington fought to maintain her rigid, aristocratic posture, but her trembling knees and smeared makeup betrayed her total ruin. She looked back at Beatrice one final time, opening her mouth to deploy one last desperate manipulation. But Maxwell stepped smoothly in front of his wife, blocking Carol's view entirely. Carol swallowed her words and allowed the agents to push her forward. Wyatt stood beside me, his tall, powerful frame, a solid wall of protection. We watched the procession of shattered criminals being dragged out of the room. The scene beyond the frosted glass doors was a masterclass in social destruction. The main dining room of Belmont's, packed with Chicago's wealthiest elites, corporate titans, and influential socialites, had ground to a complete halt. Diners stood up from their tables, holding their phones high in the air, recording every single humiliating second of the arrests. The whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Carol Kensington and Preston Kensington, Two of the most prominent figures in the city were being walked out of a steakhouse in federal handcuffs right alongside the disgraced Vance family. Their reputations were dead. Their social standing was incinerated. They would be on the front page of every major news outlet in the country before sunrise. As the agents dragged Linda Vance through the heavy glass doors and into the gauntlet of flashing cameras, her narcissistic delusion flared one final pathetic time. She twisted her neck, looking back over her shoulder at me, her face contorted with a venomous, irrational hatred. She could not accept that the girl she had abused and underestimated had orchestrated her total destruction. "You will be nothing without us!" Linda screamed, her voice cracking, echoing shrilly over the murmurs of the stunned restaurant patrons. "You hear me, Sabrina? You need us. You will always be nothing but a pathetic little orphan. You will be nothing." I stood perfectly still, flanked by the immense, unwavering support of my biological parents and my fiercely protective brother. I looked at the woman who had stolen my childhood, watching her thrash and scream as she was hauled away to face decades in a federal penitentiary. I did not feel a shred of anger. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt only the profound, peaceful weight of absolute liberation. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to make myself heard. I looked directly into Linda's manic, terrified eyes as the federal agents pulled her completely out of the room. "I am already everything you could never be," I said. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute and suffocating. Carol Kensington stood completely paralyzed, her eyes locked onto the black ink of her own signature printed on the certified offshore bank records. For 32 years, she had navigated the absolute highest echelons of global society, operating under the delusion that her extreme wealth and her meticulously crafted public persona rendered her immune to any earthly consequences. She had orchestrated the abduction of her own niece with the clinical detachment of a corporate merger, firmly believing the offshore black box would forever conceal her treason. But as she stared down at the unredacted articles of incorporation, the impenetrable fortress of her arrogance finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Preston leaned heavily over his mother's trembling shoulder. His perfectly groomed facade dissolved into a portrait of slack-jawed terror. His eyes darted frantically across the routing numbers, the dates, the undeniably documented transfer of $2.5 million, and finally the damning signature that legally tied his mother to the destruction of my life. For his entire 32 years on this earth, Preston had been completely shielded from reality. His identity, his power, and his suffocating entitlement were entirely built on the singular foundation of being the sole undisputed heir to the Kensington global empire. He had spent his entire life spending money that belonged to me, wielding corporate influence he never earned, and viewing anyone outside his astronomical tax bracket as disposable trash. The sudden, violent realization that the woman standing across the room was the true heir, the legitimate owner of the billions he had planned to inherit, caused his pampered mind to completely short-circuit. Preston looked from the documents directly to me. The sheer, unadulterated panic in his eyes morphed instantly into a chaotic, feral violence. In his highly privileged, deeply insulated reality, problems disappeared when you threw enough money at them, or failing that, when you simply destroyed the physical evidence. His frantic, desperate brain genuinely believed that if he could just rip those specific pieces of paper into shreds, the nightmare would abruptly end. He believed the truth would magically vanish. He would remain the billionaire heir apparent, and I would be erased once again. His fingers flexed involuntarily. The heavy vintage bottle of Dom Perignon slipped from his grasp. It hit the mahogany floor with a concussive shatter, sending a wave of pale green glass and foaming expensive alcohol spraying across the polished wood. "Give me those papers!" Preston roared, his voice cracking with hysterical, blind desperation. He shoved his own mother aside with such force that Carol stumbled hard against the wood-paneled wall. Preston launched himself directly across the room at me, his hands outstretched like claws, his face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious intent. He was not just trying to take the documents. He wanted to physically hurt me. He wanted to violently silence the woman who was systematically dismantling his stolen empire. I did not flinch. I did not even take a single step back. I stood my ground, my eyes locked dead on the charging, pathetic air, knowing with absolute certainty that he would never reach me. Wyatt Kensington moved with the lethal precision of a guided missile. The protective rage that had been building inside my biological brother since Linda's initial sickening confession finally detonated. Wyatt stepped directly into Preston's violent path, pivoting his broad shoulder at the exact millisecond of impact. He caught Preston perfectly in the center of his chest. The dull, sickening thud of bone against bone echoed sharply through the dining room. Preston's forward momentum was instantly and violently redirected into a breathless, stumbling retreat. Before Preston could even attempt to catch his balance or regain his footing, the double doors of the private dining room burst completely open. Two massive restaurant security guards, drawn by the sound of shattering glass and Preston's hysterical screaming, charged into the fray. Wyatt did not wait for their assistance, but he utilized their sudden presence flawlessly. He grabbed Preston by the lapels of his custom-tailored bespoke navy suit, twisted his body with brutal efficiency, and slammed the golden child face first into the floor. The two security guards instantly dropped their combined weight onto Preston's thrashing limbs. They pinned his arms forcefully behind his back, pressing their knees heavily into his spine with uncompromising authority. "Get off me!" Preston screamed, thrashing wildly and pathetically against the floorboards, his face pressing directly into the sticky puddle of spilled champagne and jagged broken glass. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am Preston Kensington. I own half this city. I will buy this restaurant and personally ensure every single one of you never works again. Get your hands off me right now." "You do not own a single thing, Preston," Wyatt growled, kneeling beside his cousin, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that instantly silenced Preston's frantic, entitled threats. "You are a complete fraud. Your entire life is a manufactured lie financed by a violent kidnapping. You stole my sister. You watched my parents grieve in agony for 32 years while you happily spent her inheritance. If you say one more word, if you make one single move, I will tell these guards to step back and I will handle you myself." Preston went completely still, his chest heaving against the wet floor. The stark reality of Wyatt's physical dominance and the absolute unyielding fury burning in his eyes finally broke through Preston's panicked delusion. The golden boy was completely defeated, pinned to the floor like a common street thug. Maxwell Kensington stepped forward. The patriarch of the Kensington Empire looked down at his restrained nephew, his face a portrait of devastating betrayal and icy, calculating resolve. He then turned his intense, terrifying gaze back to his sister-in-law. Carol had pressed herself completely flat against the mahogany wall. Her trembling hands were covering her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for an exit, searching for an ally, searching for any possible lie that could magically extract her from this catastrophic reality. There was nowhere to run. The walls were rapidly closing in. The two federal agents, Agent Miller and Agent Davis, had remained perfectly professionally still during the violent confrontation, maintaining their iron grips on Thomas and Ashley Vance. They had watched the entire chaotic spectacle unfold with analytical precision. They had heard Linda's hysterical, detailed confession. They had watched me hand over the unredacted bank statements proving the offshore wire transfer and the kidnapping payoff. They had witnessed Preston's desperate attempt to destroy federal evidence and his subsequent physical assault. The federal trap, initially set and calculated only for the Vance family's financial crimes, had suddenly and dramatically expanded to capture a much larger, much wealthier prey. Agent Miller handed Thomas Vance off to a third agent who had quietly slipped into the room to assist with the arrests. Miller adjusted his suit jacket, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unyielding government authority. He walked slowly past Linda, who was still weeping silently on the floor, and stepped directly in front of the paralyzed, hyperventilating socialite. Carol stared up at the tall federal agent. The sheer, insurmountable power of the United States government radiated from his formidable stance. He was not a private security guard she could easily bribe. He was not a restaurant manager she could arrogantly intimidate. He was the absolute, undeniable end of her elite, privileged existence, Carol Kensington Agent Miller stated, his deep voice carrying absolute finality. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound made Carol flinch violently. "No," Carol whimpered, raising her trembling hands defensively, her voice dropping to a pathetic begging whisper. "Please, you do not understand. This is a private family matter. We can settle this privately. I have money. I have resources. We can make full restitution. I know the mayor. I know the governor. I can make a phone call and clear this all up. Please do not do this. I am a respected member of this community." Agent Miller did not hesitate. He grabbed her wrist, ignoring her frantic name-dropping, and twisted it firmly behind her back. "You wired $2.5 million across international borders to facilitate the abduction of a minor. This ceased being a private family matter the exact second you funded a kidnapping. You do not get to buy your way out of this." Carol let out a high, ragged sob as the cold steel snapped shut around her wrists. Beatrice Kensington watched her sister get handcuffed, her face completely devoid of sympathy. The maternal warmth that had defined Beatrice for decades was replaced by the fierce, protective fury of a mother who had finally found her stolen child. Agent Davis stepped forward, leaving Ashley Vance sobbing pathetically against the wall. She walked over to where Preston was still pinned to the floor by the security guards. She hauled him roughly to his feet, completely ignoring his arrogant protests and indignant shouting as she slammed his wrists into a pair of tight metal handcuffs. The golden heir was hauled upright, his expensive suit ruined, his face smeared with champagne and dirt. The lead agent looks at Carol and Preston. "Kidnapping, interstate wire fraud, and tax evasion. You're both coming with us. The destruction of the Vance family and the arrest of my biological aunt and cousin taught me a profound lesson about the true nature of worth, family, and justice. For 32 years, I was conditioned to believe I was a burden, a second-class citizen, in a home built on stolen wealth and deceit. Thomas and Linda Vance tried to break my spirit, to keep me compliant, while Carol and Preston Kensington tried to erase my existence, to steal my future. Both parties believed that their unearned power and money made them completely untouchable. What they fundamentally failed to realize is that true power is not inherited or stolen. It is forged in the fires of survival. I did not need their permission to be successful, and I certainly did not need their validation to know my own value. When the people who are supposed to protect you become your greatest abusers, the most devastating revenge you can enact is simply refusing to play their toxic game. I utilized the very skills I honed to survive their neglect, my meticulous attention to detail, my unyielding focus, and my absolute drive for financial independence to systematically dismantle their empire of lies. Family is never defined by those who demand blind loyalty, nor is it defined by those who view you as a disposable asset. True family, like the immediate and fierce love I finally found with Maxwell, Beatrice, and Wyatt, is built on unwavering support, truth, and mutual respect. I did not just reclaim my stolen inheritance that night. I reclaimed my own narrative. I proved that you can endure decades of psychological manipulation and still emerge with your integrity and brilliance completely intact. Please share your own stories of breaking free from toxic relatives and reclaiming your power in the comments below. If my journey to ultimate justice resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving, thriving, and taking back control. Remember, your abusers do not write your final chapter. You do.